Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? I love to know. Let's get started. The snowstorm started earlier than anyone expected, blanketing the small town in a suffocating silence. Sarah tightened her scarf against the biting wind, her boots crunching through the snow as she carried a heavy shopping bag home. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows on the deserted road. Christmas Eve was supposed to feel magical, but tonight, the air was heavy with an eerie stillness that made her stomach churn. As she passed the corner bakery, she noticed something strange. A man stood perfectly still in the middle of the street, his face turned upward toward the dark sky. He wasn't wearing a coat or scarf, just a tattered suit that looked out of place against the pristine snow. Sarah slowed her steps, instinctively clutching her bag tighter. "Sir?" she called hesitantly, her voice trembling. He didn't move. His head tilted slightly as if he'd heard her, but his body remained rigid. The wind howled louder, and a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She quickened her pace, desperate to put distance between herself and the unsettling figure. But as she rounded the corner to her street, she froze. There, standing at the edge of her driveway, was the same man. His back was to her, his silhouette illuminated by the dim light from her porch. Sarah's breath hitched. That was impossible. Her first thought was to call for help, but her phone was buried deep in her pocket, and her fingers felt numb. Slowly, she edged closer, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light. But as she approached, she realized he wasn't alone. There were footprints, hundreds of them, pressed deep into the snow around her house, crisscrossing in chaotic patterns. They weren't human footprints, though. They were elongated, clawed, like something out of a nightmare. Her chest tightened as she reached the porch. The man was gone, but her door was slightly ajar, swaying gently in the wind. She hadn't left it open. "Hello," she whispered, stepping inside. The warm air hit her face, but it didn't bring comfort. Something was wrong. The Christmas lights on her tree blinked erratically, casting distorted shadows across the living room. A faint sound came from the kitchen, a soft scraping like nails on metal. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet moved forward as if drawn by an unseen force. She pushed the kitchen door open and stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting at her kitchen table was a figure she couldn't fully comprehend. Its body was gaunt and twisted, draped in tattered rags that seemed to move on their own. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her. In its bony hands, it clutched a single Christmas ornament, rolling it between its claws with an unsettling precision. "What do you want?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely audible. The creature tilted its head, and for a moment the room felt deathly silent. Then it spoke, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed in her mind rather than her ears. "You invited me." Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't invited anyone. This was madness. "No, I didn't," she stammered, taking a step back. The creature laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound that made her knees buckle. "You opened the door. You let me in." Her heart pounded as she tried to remember if she had actually locked the door earlier. She was sure she had. The creature stood, its form towering over her, and the air grew colder. "Now you will see," it said, its voice dripping with malevolence. "See what?" she demanded, panic rising in her throat. It raised a clawed finger and pointed to the living room. Against her better judgment, Sarah turned to look. The Christmas tree was now bare, the ornaments scattered across the floor. The lights blinked erratically, casting eerie patterns on the walls. And then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree, its face shrouded in shadow. She whipped back around, but the creature was gone. The kitchen was empty, the only sound her own ragged breathing. A loud crash from upstairs jolted her into action. She grabbed a kitchen knife, her hands trembling, and made her way to the staircase. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing through the silent house. At the top of the stairs, she paused. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the crack beneath her bedroom door. Slowly, she pushed the door open, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. On her bed lay a single note, written in a spidery, unfamiliar script. "You cannot escape what you've invited." Her hands shook as she read the words. She turned, ready to flee the house, but the doorway was no longer empty. The man from the street stood there, his face finally visible. His eyes were black voids, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. And then everything went dark. The darkness wasn't complete. There was a faint, pulsing light in the distance, like the weak heartbeat of a dying star. Sarah blinked, trying to orient herself, but the air felt heavy, pressing against her chest. She wasn't in her house anymore. The floor beneath her feet was cold, uneven stone, and the air reeked of damp earth and something metallic. Her breaths came fast, each one louder than the oppressive silence around her. She reached out, her fingers brushing against rough walls. The faint light in the distance pulsed again, drawing her gaze. She didn't want to move toward it, but the thought of staying still was worse. As she moved forward, the light grew brighter, revealing a narrow tunnel lined with jagged rocks that seemed to pulse and shimmer. Each step echoed, the sound swallowed quickly by the oppressive darkness behind her. The air was frigid, biting through her clothes and making her teeth chatter. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. It felt like the wrong thing to do, but the silence was unbearable. A whisper answered her, faint and almost imperceptible. "Sarah?" Her blood ran cold. She froze, straining her ears, but the whisper didn't come again. She pressed on, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. The tunnel widened into a cavern, and the pulsing light grew brighter, revealing something that made her stomach lurch. Hanging from the ceiling were dozens of ornaments, each glowing faintly. But they weren't normal ornaments. Inside each one there was a tiny, moving figure, a person. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their hands pressed against the glass as if they were trapped. Sarah stumbled back, her mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It was some kind of nightmare. "You see now," a voice said behind her, low and gravelly. She spun around, knife still clutched in her hand. The man from her house stood there, his dark eyes fixed on her. Only now, his form was shifting, elongating, as if he were made of smoke. "What is this?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. "This," he said, gesturing to the ornaments, "is what happens to those who invite him in." "Who?" The man's smile widened, revealing jagged teeth. "The collector." The name sent a chill down her spine. "I didn't invite anyone." The man tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. "You didn't need to. Your fear was the invitation. The moment you opened the door, he marked you." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." "Oh, it's real," he said, stepping closer. "And now you belong to him." Sarah backed away, her grip on the knife tightening. "I don't belong to anyone," she spat. The man laughed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the cavern. "Brave words. Let's see how long you hold on to them." Before she could react, he vanished, dissolving into the shadows. The pulsing light grew more intense, and the ornaments began to hum, their glow flickering like candle flames in the wind. One by one, the tiny figures inside the ornaments turned to face her, their eyes wide with desperation. They began banging on the glass, their movements frantic. "Help us," one of them mouthed, the words inaudible but clear. Sarah's stomach churned. She didn't know how to help them, or if she even could. But standing there, paralyzed by fear, wasn't an option. She moved toward the closest ornament, reaching out cautiously. The moment her fingers touched the glass, a searing pain shot through her hand. She yanked it back, crying out as black veins spread across her skin, pulsing like the light in the cavern. "Stop," a voice screamed. She turned to see a girl, no older than 10, standing at the edge of the cavern. Her hair was tangled, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes burned with intensity. "You can't touch them," the girl yelled, running toward her. "What's happening to me?" Sarah gasped, clutching her hand as the black veins crept up her arm. "He's marking you," the girl said, grabbing her uninjured hand and pulling her away from the ornaments. "You need to run." "Who are you?" "No time," the girl said, her grip surprisingly strong. "If we don't leave now, he'll take you too." The ornaments' hum grew louder, almost deafening, and the cavern began to shake. Rocks fell from the ceiling, shattering on the ground around them. The pulsing light turned blood red, casting everything in an eerie glow. The girl led Sarah back through the tunnel, the ground trembling beneath their feet. "Don't stop," she urged, her voice barely audible over the noise. As they ran, Sarah's vision blurred. The black veins were spreading faster now, snaking up her neck and making it harder to breathe. She stumbled, but the girl yanked her upright, refusing to let her fall. They burst out of the tunnel into the cold night air, the snow falling harder than before. Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. The girl knelt beside her, inspecting her arm. "It's worse than I thought," the girl said grimly. What's happening to me?" "You're becoming one of them," the girl said. "If we don't stop it, you'll end up in one of those ornaments." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand any of this." The girl hesitated, then took a deep breath. "He feeds on fear. Every year he comes during the darkest night and takes those who are most afraid. If he's marked you, it means he's chosen you as his next victim. How do I stop it?" The girl looked away, her expression haunted. "There's only one way. You have to face him." Sarah's heart sank. "Face him? How?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to a shadowy figure emerging from the woods. It was the collector, his form twisting and shifting like smoke in the wind. Sarah scrambled to her feet, clutching the knife with trembling hands. The girl stepped in front of her, her small frame defiant. "I won't let him take you," the girl said, her voice steady. The collector stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes gleaming. "Brave child," he said, his voice like 1,000 whispers. "But bravery won't save her." The girl didn't flinch. "You'll have to go through me first." The collector smiled, his teeth glinting in the dim light. "So be it." The ground beneath them cracked, and shadows erupted from the earth, coiling around the girl. She screamed, but her eyes remained locked on Sarah. "Run," she shouted. But Sarah didn't run. She couldn't leave the girl behind. Tightening her grip on the knife, she stepped forward, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was alive, pressing against Sarah like a suffocating shroud. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were sinking into an unseen abyss. Her breaths came shallow and rapid, the only sound in the void. "Wake up," a voice whispered, sharp and commanding. Her eyes snapped open, and she found herself lying on the floor of what looked like an ancient cathedral. Massive stone walls rose around her, adorned with grotesque carvings of twisted faces and clawed hands. Stained glass windows, depicting scenes of torment, filtered a dim, blood-red light into the space. Sarah sat up, her head pounding. Her knife was still in her hand, though her grip was weak. Across the room, the collector stood motionless, his black eyes fixed on her. His form was more distinct now, tall and skeletal, with a cloak that seemed to writhe like living shadows. "Where am I?" she demanded, forcing herself to her feet. "This is my domain," he said, his voice reverberating through the cavernous space. "Where all who resist me are brought." She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the knife. "What do you want from me?" The collector tilted his head, his twisted smile revealing rows of jagged teeth. "I want nothing. It is you who must decide what happens next." Before she could respond, the room shifted. The walls seemed to ripple, the grotesque carvings moving as if alive. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows, and Sarah spun around, her heart racing. From the darkness emerged figures, humanoid but wrong. Their skin was pale and stretched tight over their bones, their eyes hollow and glowing faintly. They moved jerkily, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "What are they?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They are the lost," the collector said calmly. "Those who tried to escape their fate but failed." The figures advanced, their movements slow but relentless. Sarah backed away, her mind racing. The knife in her hand felt useless against them, but it was all she had. "Face them," the collector said, his voice cold and detached. "Or join them." "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "I won't become one of them." She lunged at the nearest figure, slashing with the knife. It connected, but instead of blood, the creature dissolved into smoke, its hollow eyes lingering for a moment before fading away. Another one came at her, then another. Sarah fought with everything she had, the knife cutting through the air as the creatures closed in. Each one dissolved upon contact, but their numbers seemed endless. "You cannot fight forever," the collector said, watching her struggle. Sarah's arms ached, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. The creatures were overwhelming her, their cold, skeletal hands brushing against her skin. Desperation clawed at her mind as she realized she couldn't keep this up. "Stop," she screamed, her voice echoing through the cathedral. To her surprise, the creatures froze. The collector stepped closer, his dark form towering over her. "You are beginning to understand," he said. "Understand what?" She spat, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. "This is not a battle of strength," he said. "It is a battle of will. Your fear feeds them. Your doubt gives them power. Only by confronting the truth can you hope to prevail." "What truth?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. He raised a clawed hand and the room shifted again. The grotesque carvings on the walls melted away, replaced by scenes from her own life. Her childhood home, her school, the hospital room where her mother had died. "No," she whispered, backing away. "Stop this." But the images kept coming, each one sharper and more painful than the last. Her failures, her regrets, the moments she wished she could erase, they played out before her like a cruel film. "Your fear has always been with you," the collector said. "It is the shadow you cannot outrun." Sarah fell to her knees, the weight of his words crushing her. "I can't do this," she whispered. "You can," another voice said, soft but firm. She turned to see the girl from before, standing at the edge of the room. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "Don't listen to him," the girl said. "He wants you to believe you're powerless, but you're not." Sarah shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I'm not strong enough." "Yes, you are," the girl insisted. "You just have to believe it." The collector laughed, a low, mocking sound. "Her belief will not save her." The girl ignored him, stepping closer to Sarah. "You've faced so much already. You've fought harder than anyone else would. Don't give up now." Something in the girl's voice cut through Sarah's despair. She looked up, meeting the girl's intense gaze. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stand up," the girl said. "Face him. And don't let him see your fear." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She pushed herself to her feet, the knife still clutched in her hand. Her legs trembled, but she stood tall, her eyes locking onto the collector. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. The collector's smile faltered, just for a moment. The shadows around him seemed to waver, and the glowing eyes of the creatures dimmed. "You cannot defy me," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "Yes, I can," Sarah said firmly. "You don't control me. I control me." The room began to shake, the walls cracking and crumbling. The creatures dissolved into smoke, their forms vanishing into the air. The collector stepped back, his dark eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he said, his voice echoing as his form began to dissipate. Sarah stood her ground, watching as the cathedral collapsed around her. The red light faded, replaced by a blinding white glow. She shielded her eyes, bracing herself for whatever came next. When the light subsided, she found herself back in her living room. The Christmas tree stood untouched, its lights twinkling softly. The snow outside had stopped, and the house was silent. The knife was still in her hand, its blade clean. She stared at it, then at the front door, which was now firmly closed. A single ornament hung on the tree, glowing faintly. Inside, a tiny figure moved, a girl, her face calm and peaceful. Sarah stepped closer, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. The ornament's glow faded, and the figure disappeared. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of peace. The shadows in her mind were still there, but they no longer controlled her. She had faced her fear, and she had won. The air outside was sharp and cold, biting against Sarah's cheeks as she stepped onto her front porch. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the fresh snow crunching beneath her boots. The world was eerily quiet, as if it too were catching its breath after the chaos. But Sarah wasn't fooled. The collector's parting words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, this isn't over. Asterisk, she knew this was no victory, it was a brief reprieve. As she looked out into the snowy street, something caught her eye. At the end of her driveway, barely visible under the moonlight, was a figure. Small, hunched, and shivering. "Hello?" Sarah called out, her voice hesitant but firm. The figure didn't respond. It moved slightly, a jerky, unsettling motion, and Sarah's stomach churned. She tightened her grip on the knife she had instinctively brought with her. She stepped cautiously down the driveway, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The figure became clearer. A child, wrapped in tattered clothes, their back turned to her. "Are you okay?" she asked, keeping her distance. The child turned slowly and Sarah froze. The face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that gleamed like polished onyx. A faint, chilling smile spread across their lips. "You're her," the child said, their voice soft but unnervingly hollow. "Her who?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. "The one who thinks she can escape." Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding. The child tilted their head, their smile widening unnaturally. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay calm. The child took a step forward, their movements unnatural and stiff. "You saw him, didn't you? The collector. He's watching. Always watching." Sarah's grip tightened on the knife. "Stay back." The child laughed, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "You can't stop it. No one can. Once he marks you, it's only a matter of time." "I don't believe you," Sarah said, though doubt gnawed at her. "You should," the child whispered, their voice suddenly right in her ear. Sarah spun around, but the child was gone. Her eyes darted wildly, searching the darkness, but there was no trace of them. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and Sarah's breath quickened. She turned back toward the house, but it looked different. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. A sense of dread settled over her as she realized she hadn't left it that way. She approached cautiously, the knife raised. The warmth of the house was gone, replaced by an unnatural chill. Inside, the Christmas tree's lights flickered erratically, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Ornaments dangled lifelessly, their surfaces tarnished and dull. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the silence. A faint sound came from the living room, a soft rustling like paper being crumpled. She moved toward it, her footsteps slow and deliberate. When she entered the room, she froze. The ornament that had glowed earlier now lay shattered on the floor, its shards scattered like tiny stars. In its place was a piece of paper, aged and yellowed, with jagged handwriting scrawled across it. Asterisk, "You're not done yet." Asterisk. A sharp, stinging cold shot through her arm, and she whipped around, slashing blindly with the knife. But there was nothing there. Panic gripped her as she realized the house wasn't safe anymore. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. And then she heard it, the faint sound of bells, distant and haunting. "No," she whispered, backing away. "Not again." The bells grew louder, each chime reverberating through her chest. She bolted for the front door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. "You can't run," a voice said, deep and resonant. She spun around, her back pressed against the door. The collector stood in the middle of the room, his presence more menacing than before. His form was sharper, more defined, and his black eyes seemed to bore into her soul. "You thought you could defy me?" he said, his voice like a low growl. "I'm not afraid of you," Sarah said, though her voice wavered. He smiled, his jagged teeth glinting in the flickering light. "Oh, but you are. And that fear will consume you." The room began to close in, the walls narrowing as the shadows thickened. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way out. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "Because you dared to resist," he said. "And now you will pay the price." Before she could respond, the floor beneath her gave way and she was falling, plunging into a dark, endless void. The wind roared in her ears and her screams were swallowed by the abyss. When she landed, it was with a jarring thud. She groaned, pushing herself up. The ground was hard and cold, and the air smelled of damp earth. She was in a cavern, its walls glowing faintly with an eerie, green light. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, pulsating with an otherworldly energy. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is where it begins," the collector's voice echoed, though he was nowhere to be seen. The symbols on the wall seemed to shift, forming images. They depicted a figure, her, standing against a monstrous shadow. "What do you want from me?" she yelled, her voice breaking. "To see if you're worthy," the voice replied. "Worthy of what?" "To survive." The ground trembled and the symbols glowed brighter. From the darkness emerged more of the pale, skeletal figures, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Sarah gripped the knife, her fear giving way to determination. She wouldn't let them win. As they closed in, she realized that this wasn't just about fighting, it was about proving to herself that she was stronger than her fear. She took a deep breath, steadied her stance, and prepared to face them head-on. The cavern's silence was shattered by the low, guttural growls of the skeletal figures inching closer. Their hollow eyes gleamed in the dim green light, each step a harbinger of dread. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears, but she refused to let the fear paralyze her. She tightened her grip on the knife, her knuckles white against the worn leather handle. The collector's voice echoed through the cavern, cold and mocking. "This is where you break, Sarah. Where the shadows claim you for good." "Not this time," she whispered, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. The first creature lunged, its bony hands outstretched. Sarah swung the knife with all her strength, the blade slicing clean through its torso. The creature disintegrated into a cloud of ash, but two more emerged from the darkness to take its place. Every movement felt like a battle against her own instincts to flee. Her arms burned, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Yet with each strike, she felt something shift within her, a spark of defiance growing brighter. The creatures were relentless, their attacks coordinated as though driven by a single, sinister will. But Sarah was relentless too, her determination keeping her on her feet. For every creature that dissolved into ash, another appeared, and another. "You can't win," the collector taunted. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding her. "Your strength is nothing but borrowed time." But Sarah didn't respond. She focused on the fight, each swing of the knife becoming more precise, more deliberate. Her fear wasn't gone, but it was no longer in control. The cavern began to shift. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed faster, their light growing almost blinding. The ground trembled beneath her feet, cracks spidering out from where she stood. "What's happening?" she shouted, her voice nearly drowned out by the rumble of the earth. The collector's laughter echoed, louder and more menacing. "The game changes, Sarah. Let's see how far you're willing to go." Suddenly the creatures stopped. They froze mid-attack, their hollow eyes turning to the walls as if drawn to the symbols. The air grew heavy, each breath feeling like a struggle against an invisible weight. Then, from the largest crack in the ground, something began to emerge. A massive, shadowy form rose from the depths, its shape constantly shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. It had no eyes, yet Sarah could feel its gaze piercing through her. Tendrils of darkness writhed from its body, reaching out like seeking hands. Sarah stumbled back, the knife trembling in her grip. What is that?" The collector's voice was calm, almost amused. "The heart of your fear. The truth you refuse to face. Fight it if you can." The shadow creature lunged, faster than Sarah anticipated. She barely dodged, the tendrils brushing against her arm and leaving a freezing, stinging sensation. She slashed at it, but the blade passed through as if cutting air. Panic clawed at her chest. The knife was useless. She needed another way. The creature lunged again, and she scrambled to avoid it, her back slamming into the cavern wall. The glowing symbols flared as she touched them, and a strange warmth spread through her hand. An idea sparked. She turned toward the wall, tracing the glowing symbols with her fingers. The warmth grew stronger, spreading up her arm and into her chest. The symbols shifted under her touch, their shapes rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. The shadow creature roared, its tendrils lashing out. One wrapped around her ankle, pulling her off her feet. She cried out, the knife slipping from her grasp as she clawed at the ground. "Get up, Sarah," the collector's voice boomed, no longer mocking but commanding. She reached for the wall, her fingers finding another symbol. As she pressed against it, the warmth turned into a searing heat. A beam of light shot from the wall, striking the shadow creature and forcing it back. The creature howled, its form flickering like a dying flame. Sarah pushed herself to her feet, her hands flying over the symbols. Each touch sent another beam of light toward the creature, weakening it further. The cavern trembled violently, the cracks in the ground widening. Chunks of stone fell from the ceiling, and Sarah knew the place wouldn't hold much longer. With one final push, she pressed both hands against the largest symbol. The light exploded outward, engulfing the shadow creature in a blinding glow. Its roar echoed through the cavern, fading into silence as its form dissolved. The light dimmed and the cavern was still. The glowing symbols faded, leaving the walls bare. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from exhaustion. "You did it," a voice said softly. She looked up to see the girl from the ornament standing nearby. Her form was faint, almost ghostly, but her eyes were warm and kind. What was that thing?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The manifestation of your deepest fear, the girl said. The part of you that believed you weren't strong enough. Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand. Why me? Why all of this? Because you were chosen, the girl said. Not by the collector, but by something far older. Something that sees the strength within you. The ground trembled again and the girl's form began to fade. Wait, Sarah called out. What happens now? Now you decide, the girl said. The shadows will always be there, but so will your light. Remember that. The cavern began to collapse, the walls crumbling around her. Sarah braced herself, but instead of being buried, she felt a sudden rush of air. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her living room. The Christmas tree lights glowed softly, and the shattered ornament was gone. She sat there for a long moment, her mind racing. The knife was still in her hand, but it felt different. Lighter, almost warm. She placed it on the table and leaned back, closing her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt free. But as the clock chimed midnight, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. The collector's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, this isn't over. Asterisk. The chime of the clock echoed through the living room, each strike a reminder that midnight had arrived. Sarah sat on the couch, her hands trembling as they rested on her lap. Her breaths were shallow, the weight of everything she had endured pressing down on her chest. She glanced at the knife on the table, its blade catching the soft glow of the Christmas lights. It looked ordinary now, but she knew it wasn't. The house was silent, too silent. It was the kind of silence that crept under your skin and made every shadow seem alive. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, expecting to see something shift, something unnatural. But there was nothing. Yet the unease lingered, a knot tightening in her stomach. She stood pacing the room. The warmth of the earlier fight, the strange light that had saved her, was gone, replaced by the familiar chill of fear. She paused by the window, peering out into the snow-covered street. It was empty, the world outside still and serene. But serenity was a lie. The faint sound of bells reached her ears. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Her heart sank. No, she whispered, stepping back from the window. The bells grew louder, each chime resonating deep within her. They weren't the cheerful jingle of Christmas sleigh bells. These were slow, deliberate, and ominous. A knock at the door made her jump. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She turned to face the door, her mind racing. No one should be out there. Not at this hour. Not after everything. The knock came again, louder this time. Sarah hesitated, her feet rooted to the floor. She glanced at the knife on the table, then back at the door. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling. No response. Her hands balled into fists at her sides. She couldn't let fear control her. Not again. She took a deep breath, grabbed the knife, and approached the door. With a shaky hand, she unlocked it and pulled it open. The porch was empty. The snow lay undisturbed, glittering under the soft glow of the street lamp. She stepped outside, her eyes scanning the yard. Nothing. Then she noticed it. A single red ornament sat on the ground, its surface glossy and unblemished. It was identical to the one that had started this nightmare. Her breath caught in her throat as she crouched down, hesitating before picking it up. As her fingers brushed the surface, a voice whispered in her ear. Did you think it was over? She spun around, but there was no one there. The ornament felt cold in her hand, colder than the winter air around her. She wanted to throw it, to smash it against the ground, but something stopped her. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound making her jump. She turned back to the house, but the windows were dark. No light from the Christmas tree, no warmth from the living room. The ornament in her hand began to glow, a faint red light pulsing from within. Before she could react, the light consumed her. She was no longer on her porch. The world around her was unfamiliar, a desolate expanse of snow and shadow. The sky was an endless black void, and the air was thick with a strange, metallic taste. In the distance, she saw a figure, a tall, imposing silhouette that she recognized all too well. The collector. He stood motionless, his black eyes fixed on her. You've come far, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the frozen wasteland. But you've only scratched the surface. What do you want from me? Sarah demanded, her voice echoing in the emptiness. The collector smiled, a slow, menacing grin. "I want you to see." "See what?" "The truth." Before she could respond, the ground beneath her cracked. She stumbled, falling to her knees as the snow gave way to darkness. The world around her shifted, the desolate expanse replaced by a new, horrifying scene. She was in a room, a small, dimly lit nursery. The walls were painted a soft pastel, adorned with cheerful drawings of animals and stars. A crib sat in the center, draped with a delicate white canopy. But the room felt wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the shadows in the corners seemed to move. A faint, mournful lullaby played, its melody haunting and distorted. Sarah approached the crib cautiously, her heart pounding. As she reached it, the canopy shifted, revealing what lay inside. A baby, pale and still, its eyes wide open and staring. Its tiny hands were clenched into fists, and its mouth was frozen in a silent scream. Sarah's stomach churned and she stumbled back, tears streaming down her face. "This is your truth," the collector said, appearing behind her. She whirled around, the knife in her hand shaking. "You're lying. This isn't real." "It's as real as the fear you carry," he said. "The guilt you try to bury. The choices you regret." "I don't know what you're talking about," she screamed. The collector stepped closer, his towering presence overwhelming. "You do. You've always known." The room dissolved around her, replaced by another memory. She was in a hospital corridor, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Her younger self sat in a chair, clutching her stomach, tears streaming down her face. "No," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "Don't do this." "You left them," the collector said. "You made a choice and you've been running from it ever since." "I didn't have a choice," she shouted, her voice breaking. The collector's gaze was unrelenting. "There's always a choice." The memory shifted again, and Sarah found herself back in her childhood home. Her parents sat at the kitchen table, their faces etched with worry. She stood in the doorway, a suitcase in hand, her heart heavy with the decision she had made. "Stop it," she cried, covering her ears. "I don't want to see this." The collector's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You can't run from your past, Sarah. It's what brought you here." The scenes played out around her, each one a reminder of the moments she had tried to forget. The choices she regretted, the pain she had caused, the guilt that had followed her like a shadow. She fell to her knees, sobbing, the weight of it all crushing her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because only by facing your fear can you break free," the collector said. "But freedom comes at a price." "What price?" The collector smiled. "You'll see." The world around her began to dissolve again, the memories fading into darkness. She was back in the desolate wasteland, the snow crunching beneath her knees. The collector stood before her, his black eyes gleaming. "Your fear has defined you for too long," he said. "It's time to let it go." "How?" she asked, her voice trembling. "By making a choice," he said, holding out his hand. In his palm was the glowing red ornament. "Take it and you'll be free." Sarah stared at the ornament, her mind racing. She didn't trust him, but she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward it. "What happens if I don't?" she asked. "Then you'll remain here, trapped by your fear forever." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the ornament. The collector's smile widened. With a deep breath, she made her decision. Story 2. The snowstorm came out of nowhere, blanketing the tiny town of Pine Hollow in an eerie silence. Everything felt wrong that night. The Christmas lights strung along rooftops flickered sporadically, like they were fighting to stay alive. Anna pulled her coat tighter around her as she hurried down Main Street, her boots crunching against the snow. She'd only meant to grab a last-minute gift for her younger brother, but now, as the town seemed to grow darker with every passing second, she wished she had stayed home. There was something in the air, something that made her skin crawl. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder. Empty streets. No movement, except for the faint swaying of an oversized Santa decoration in front of the hardware store. But still, the unease clawed at her. Anna shook her head, trying to laugh at herself. "Get it together," she muttered, quickening her pace toward her car. The keys trembled in her hands as she fumbled to unlock the door. Then she froze. Behind her, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of bells. Not the cheerful kind you'd hear in a Christmas carol. These bells had a discordant, almost menacing ring. Her breath hitched as she turned, her eyes scanning the street. Nothing. just the wind whipping through the alleyways and the glow of streetlights reflecting off the snow. But the bells, they didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. Anna's pulse raced. She jumped into the car, locking the doors behind her. Her hands shook as she turned the key in the ignition. The car sputtered but didn't start. She tried again. Nothing. Panic set in as the bells chimed louder, now almost deafening. Suddenly, her rearview mirror caught movement. Her heart dropped. A figure stood at the edge of the parking lot, shrouded in shadows. She couldn't make out any details, but it was tall, inhumanly tall, and it didn't move. It just stood there, staring, or so it seemed. Anna didn't dare breathe. Her eyes remained fixed on the figure, her mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just someone out for a walk. But deep down she knew better. The bell stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed in on her, suffocating, making her every thought scream to run. Without thinking, Anna grabbed her phone, but the screen wouldn't light up. That. She cursed under her breath, her chest tightening with fear. The figure hadn't moved, but she swore it was closer now. "Help!" she screamed, banging on the car window. The sound echoed through the empty street, swallowed by the storm. Then a low, guttural laugh broke the silence. It wasn't coming from the figure, it was coming from behind her. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly, terrified of what she might see. There, in the back seat, a pair of glowing red eyes stared back at her. Anna's heart slammed against her chest, each beat deafening in her ears. She froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The red eyes in the back seat didn't blink, didn't move. They just watched her. Her hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but she stopped herself. She couldn't let herself panic. Not yet. But with every second, the pressure in the car seemed to mount, the air thickening like it was alive, suffocating her. She had to get out of here. Her fingers brushed the door handle again, but just as she was about to turn it, the back seat light flickered to life. The air turned frigid, colder than the snowstorm outside. The temperature inside the car dropped so suddenly that Anna's breath came out in visible clouds. Her whole body shivered uncontrollably as the red eyes intensified, glowing brighter. Then they blinked. It was the slow, deliberate blink of something that had been watching her for far too long. Anna snapped her eyes away, focusing on the steering wheel, trying to gather her thoughts. The bells rang again, this time so close it felt like they were inside the car with her. Her body was shaking, but not from the cold. It was fear, pure and overwhelming. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. "Just start the car," she whispered under her breath, her fingers fumbling against the ignition once more. This time the car responded. The engine roared to life with a mechanical groan. Relief flooded her for a split second, but before she could shift into drive, something heavy slammed against the roof of the car. The impact made the entire vehicle rock, and Anna screamed, her hands clutching the wheel as she looked up. A dark figure, impossibly tall, was standing on top of the car, its shadow stretching across the windshield like a black veil. It didn't move. It just stood there, an unnerving weight pressing down on the metal, bending it slightly under its presence. The bells rang again, now accompanied by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very foundation of the car. Anna was paralyzed. There was no rational thought in her mind, only fear. She threw the car into reverse, slamming her foot down on the gas pedal. The tires squealed as they spun in the snow, but she couldn't move. The car was stuck, trapped beneath the weight of whatever was on the roof. The growling grew louder, more intense. Anna's eyes darted from the rearview mirror to the side mirror, desperately searching for any sign of help. But the street was empty, and the snowstorm only made the scene seem more isolated, more hopeless. Her thoughts spiraled. What was that thing on the roof? What did it want? How could she escape? Her eyes landed on the passenger side door, and a sudden, frantic idea sparked in her mind. She unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. Without another moment's hesitation, she yanked it open, throwing herself out of the car. The snow hit her like a wall, cold and sharp against her skin. She barely felt it though. All she could think about was running, getting as far away as possible from whatever had just tried to claim her. But as soon as her feet hit the snow, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps behind her. Anna's heart stopped. She didn't dare look back. She ran. She sprinted down the street, her breath ragged, her legs burning from the effort. But the footsteps were faster, louder, closer. The bells rang again, and this time they were joined by a horrifying screech that sent shivers down her spine. She risked a glance over her shoulder, and for just a moment she thought she saw the dark figure standing in the middle of the street, watching her. Then it moved. It moved faster than anything humanly possible. In the blink of an eye, it was right behind her. Anna screamed, her body moving on instinct as she turned down an alley, the narrow walls on either side offering some small comfort. But the screeching grew louder, and the air felt thick with malevolent energy. Whatever this thing was, it was toying with her. The alley ended at a dead end. She spun around, desperate, her back pressed against the cold brick wall as she tried to catch her breath. Her mind raced. She had to hide. Had to do something. But what? The bells rang again, but this time they weren't alone. The sound of footsteps mixed with the jingle of the bells, growing louder and louder until it felt like the world itself was closing in on her. Anna's eyes darted around, and in the dim light she spotted something. A door, slightly ajar, leading into what looked like an old storage shed. She didn't think twice. She dashed toward it, throwing her body against the door. It creaked open just enough for her to slip inside. The door slammed shut behind her, and she stumbled in the darkness, her hands searching for something, anything to give her a sense of safety. But there was nothing. Just darkness and cold. And then the bells. The sound was right outside the shed now, echoing off the walls, reverberating through her skull. Anna held her breath, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside. The bell rang once, then twice. And then the whisper. A voice. Faint at first, but growing louder, clearer. Anna? Her blood froze. The voice was familiar but wrong. It wasn't her mother's voice. It wasn't anyone she recognized. It was something else. Something ancient. Anna? The door creaked. Anna's pulse thudded in her ears as the whisper echoed in the dark shed. She stood still, barely daring to breathe. Her eyes strained to adjust to the pitch-black surroundings, but all she could see were vague shapes of forgotten crates and broken furniture piled in corners. There was no escape, no way out, and worst of all, she could hear it. The whisper was getting closer, as if the very walls were closing in on her. Anna? The voice was faint, haunting, almost playful. It wasn't coming from the door, though. No, it was coming from within the room itself. The coldness, the stench of rot in the air grew heavier, like the very ground she stood on was alive, pulsating beneath her feet. She moved backward, her feet slipping in the ice-covered floor as her mind raced for a plan. Should she try the door again? Should she break a window? Or was she better off staying silent, hoping whatever was coming for her would go away? But deep down she knew. It wouldn't leave her alone. It couldn't. The whisper came again, closer, clearer. Anna, do you remember the story? The question was simple, but the tone sent a chill through her, making the hairs on her neck stand up. She hadn't heard that voice in years. Her breath caught in her throat. Could it be? No, she whispered hoarsely to herself. This isn't possible. Her mind flung itself back to another time, a time she had buried long ago. A memory, long suppressed, began to creep forward like an unwelcome guest. She was a child just 8 years old. It was Christmas Eve, the most magical time of the year. The house had been filled with the warm, familiar smell of gingerbread cookies, the fireplace crackling with comfort. But that night, something felt different. Her family had gathered in the living room, preparing to open presents, but her father, a man of few words, had been silent for hours. He sat near the window watching the snow fall as if he were waiting for something, or someone. Anna had asked him what was wrong, but he simply gave her a look she couldn't decipher, one that left her with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. We're not alone tonight, he had told her. She remembered it so clearly, though she hadn't understood what he meant. Not alone, she had repeated, confused. Who's coming? He had only smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind of smile you give when you're hiding something you're not ready to share. That night, after her parents had gone to bed, Anna had snuck downstairs to peek at the presents. But when she passed the window, she stopped. The snowstorm had started then, just as it was tonight, but what made her stop in her tracks was what she saw through the glass. A figure standing at the edge of the yard, its silhouette barely visible against the swirling snow. It wasn't a person. It was something much taller, much darker, something inhuman. The shape of it was impossible to define, like the storm itself had shaped a creature from the darkness. Anna remembered feeling a coldness seep into her bones as the figure's eyes locked onto hers, glowing faintly through the snowstorm. She had tried to move, but her legs wouldn't obey. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. Then, the figure had tilted its head, slowly, as though it were studying her. And in that moment, she had heard it, a whisper, so faint she wasn't sure it had even happened. "Anna, you're not supposed to see me." The memory had always stayed with her, haunting her dreams, her waking moments. It was a memory she had tried to forget, tried to convince herself was just a nightmare, something her child's mind had conjured up. But standing here, in this shed, in the dead of night, with that same whisper filling the air, she realized with horror that the thing from her childhood wasn't a nightmare. It was real. "Anna?" The voice this time wasn't a whisper. It was a command. Her blood ran cold. The figure from the yard had spoken those same words all those years ago. The same words. She couldn't stay here any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air pressing against her chest like a vice. But when she turned to the door, it wasn't there. The door, the window, everything had vanished. The walls of the shed had transformed, the room twisting and contorting into something unfamiliar. It wasn't a shed anymore. It was a place she had never seen, a twisted, darkened version of reality where there was no escape. Her heart raced, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through her as she turned in every direction, searching for a way out. But it was as if the shed had swallowed her whole, trapping her in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The whisper echoed again, now coming from everywhere, filling the space. "Anna, we've been waiting for you." Anna stumbled backward, her legs weak, her mind reeling. The room wasn't just dark, it was suffocating, a heavy presence hanging in the air. Something ancient and hungry. The shadows shifted. The air thickened. Then she saw them. Figures appearing from the corners of the room, emerging from the darkness like ghosts taking shape. They were tall, towering over her, and their faces were obscured, hidden by shadows. But the eyes glowed red, just like the ones she had seen earlier. The bells rang again, this time louder, closer. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. There was nowhere to go. The figures moved closer, their presence like a weight pressing against her chest. Their voices, once faint whispers, now filled her head, each one calling her name in different tones, each one more distorted, more unnatural. "Anna, Anna." One of the figures reached out, its hand long and bony, its fingers curling toward her. The icy touch of its hand brushed her cheek, and Anna screamed, stumbling backward. She hit the wall, but there was no escaping now. The shadows closed in. The room wasn't just dark anymore. It was alive. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the air. "You belong to us now, Anna." The world around Anna spun wildly, the room twisting and distorting with every heartbeat. The figures surrounded her, their glowing red eyes now the only source of light in the suffocating darkness. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were savoring her fear, drawn to it like moths to a flame. The icy air in the room stung her skin, biting into her, freezing her to the bone. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as if something had blocked it, choking her from the inside. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled, her hands reaching for something to hold on to, but the walls kept shifting, moving, slipping further away. "Anna," the voice whispered again, now coming from every direction, surrounding her, echoing in her mind. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling for an escape. There had to be something, anything, that could get her out of here. She had to wake up. This couldn't be real. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the truth. This wasn't just a nightmare. This was happening. The figures, the whispers, the cold, they were real. The one closest to her stepped forward, its towering figure looming over her. It was even taller than she had imagined, its height almost unnatural. The shadows around it seemed to deepen, as though it was drawing all the light into itself. Its face was still obscured, hidden in darkness, but Anna could feel its presence, feel its eyes on her, judging her. "Do you remember?" the figure rasped, its voice low and gravelly. The question was cold, empty of any warmth, and it sent a shiver down Anna's spine. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't remember." The figure's shadowed face tilted as though it were considering her response. "You will," it murmured, its voice slithering into her mind like poison. "Sooner or later, you will." Before Anna could even react, she felt a sharp pull in her chest, as if something invisible was yanking her toward the center of the room. Her body jerked forward, and her breath left her in a gasp. The world around her seemed to spiral, warping into 1,000 pieces. The figures closed in, their hands reaching for her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, and each touch sent a wave of nausea through her. The walls around her distorted again, and suddenly she was no longer in the shed. She was in her childhood home. The living room, dimly lit by the dying embers of the fireplace, stretched out before her. She could see her mother, sitting in her favorite chair by the fire, a book in her hands. Her father stood near the window, gazing out at the falling snow. The scene was so familiar, so comforting, that it almost felt like nothing had changed. But as Anna looked closer, she realized something was wrong. The figures from the shed had followed her. They were there in her home, standing in the shadows. Their eyes glowed, their forms barely visible in the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. "Anna," her mother said softly, her voice strangely distant. "We've been waiting for you." Anna turned sharply to look at her, but her mother's face was no longer her own. It was twisted, warped, as if her features had been melted into something inhuman. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, devoid of any emotion or warmth. Anna stepped back, fear flooding her chest. She could feel the cold again, the same biting chill from the shed creeping into her bones. The air grew heavier, and she could feel it all around her, the presence of the figures pressing in from all sides. "Why are you doing this?" Anna gasped, her voice breaking with desperation. The figures didn't answer. They just watched her, their red eyes burning into her, their silence more terrifying than any answer they could give. Suddenly, she was pulled again, her body jerking violently as if some invisible force were dragging her through time itself. The room blurred around her, and she stumbled, barely able to keep her footing. She was no longer in her home. She was in the middle of the street, standing in the snowstorm again, the one she had seen earlier that night. But this time it was different. The street was empty, save for the same dark figure standing at the far end, its silhouette barely visible against the whiteout. The bells rang again, their discordant chime echoing through the storm. "Anna," the figure called in a voice that made her bones ache. "You cannot escape." Anna turned, her heart pounding. She could see the figure's glowing red eyes, and for the first time she realized something truly horrifying. It wasn't just one figure. It was many. A whole army of them stood hidden in the storm, their eyes glowing, their forms barely discernible through the falling snow. They were everywhere, closing in on her from all sides. She spun around, trying to run, but the snow had turned to thick, frozen sludge beneath her feet, holding her in place. No matter how hard she tried, her legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground had become part of them, part of the nightmare that was swallowing her whole. She heard the bells again, louder now, ringing in her ears. The laughter, that low, guttural laugh, filled the air, growing louder and louder until it drowned out all other sound. "Anna?" The voice came from everywhere, from all directions. "Anna?" The air was suffocating. She couldn't breathe. The world around her began to pulse with a sickening, unnatural rhythm. And then she felt it. The cold fingers. They brushed against her neck, dragging slowly across her skin like a caress, but it was the coldest thing she had ever felt. She gasped in horror, trying to swat them away, but they kept coming, pulling her toward the figure that stood at the end of the street, its red eyes burning brighter, hotter, as if it were feeding on her fear. She had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. The figure's face, a distorted and monstrous mask, twisted into a grin, and it stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out for her. And in that moment, Anna knew the truth. She wasn't just trapped in this world. She was being dragged back into something much worse. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for her. The world around Anna began to tremble as the coldness intensified. It was as if the very earth beneath her feet was shifting, splitting apart to reveal something far darker. The shadows that surrounded her stretched like dark tendrils, their forms twisting and writhing in the air as if alive, hungry, and eager for something, or someone, to devour. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the wind, a cold wind that felt like it was coming from deep within the earth, a wind that carried with it the scent of decay and death. The bells rang again, their ringing growing louder, more frantic, almost like they were calling to something, summoning it closer. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow and ragged. She was trapped. She couldn't move. The snow beneath her feet had turned to ice, holding her in place as if the ground itself was part of the trap. Her body felt frozen not just by the cold, but by the sheer force of terror that had gripped her. The figure at the end of the street, the one with the glowing red eyes, took another step forward. Its body, shrouded in darkness, seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though it was feeding off the fear that radiated from Anna. Its gaze never left her, its eyes boring into hers with a hunger that went beyond anything human. "Anna," the voice echoed again, cold and cruel. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the shed, the same voice that had tormented her in her childhood home. It was impossible to escape it, impossible to ignore. The ground beneath her began to crack, fissures spreading like veins, releasing a faint red glow from deep below. The air itself seemed to thicken, growing heavier with each passing second. She could feel the presence of something beneath the earth, something ancient, something powerful, and it was rising. "Do you remember now?" The figure's voice cut through the air like a blade, its tone mocking and triumphant. "Do you remember what you saw that night?" Anna's mind spun, her memories racing, trying to piece together the fragments of her past. The snowstorm, the figure standing in the yard, her father's warning, she remembered all of it. But there was something more. Something just beyond her reach. The figure stepped closer, its shadow swallowing the street, encroaching on her. Its form was taller than she had ever realized, towering over her like a living nightmare. The faint red glow from its eyes reflected in the ice, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. It moved with a strange fluidity, as if it wasn't bound by the same laws of reality. Anna's breath caught in her throat. She knew this thing, this creature. The memory hit her like a bolt of lightning, and she stumbled backward, the ice beneath her feet cracking as her mind raced to make sense of it. It was the same figure from her childhood. The same one that had stood in her yard, watching her through the snowstorm. The one her father had warned her about. She remembered the words her father had spoken, the ones she had never fully understood until now. "We're not alone tonight." Anna's hands trembled as the full weight of her father's warning crashed down on her. He hadn't meant that there were other people with them. He had meant that something else was coming. And now it was here. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice low and filled with an unearthly power. "You never could." Her mind reeled, her heart thundering in her chest. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. The snowstorm had become a blizzard, the winds howling like a chorus of tormented souls. The ice beneath her feet was no longer solid. She could feel it crack with every step she took, as though the ground itself was giving way. The figure was so close now, its presence almost suffocating. Anna could feel its cold gaze on her, its eyes boring into her soul. It was as if it was feeding off her fear, using it to grow stronger. But then, just as she thought she would collapse from the weight of it all, something shifted. A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision. She turned quickly, hoping for an escape, but there was nothing. Just the swirling storm, the figure looming over her, and the unrelenting cold. The ground beneath her cracked again, this time in a jagged, violent split that stretched wide, revealing a dark abyss beneath. The sound of the earth breaking was deafening, like the roar of a storm made of pure anguish. Anna stumbled back, her legs failing her as she tried to move. But the crack in the earth was growing, the abyss widening, and the figure's red eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that froze her in place. "Come to me," the figure said, its voice no longer a whisper but a commanding force that shook the very air. "You are mine now." Anna shook her head frantically, desperate to break free from its grasp. She tried to take a step back, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground was holding her there, binding her to the earth. The abyss below her deepened, the red glow from its depths casting an eerie light on everything around her. The winds howled louder, the snow swirling violently, as if a storm of unimaginable power was descending upon her. "Don't you remember?" the figure asked again, its voice filled with malice. "Don't you remember what you promised?" The question hit Anna like a punch to the gut. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her past. A promise? What promise? And then the memory came flooding back. It was Christmas Eve so many years ago. Her father had sat her down, his face grim, his voice full of warning. "Anna," he had said, his eyes filled with a sadness she had never understood. "If you ever see it again, you must never look away. You must never run." At the time, she hadn't understood what he meant. But now, standing in front of the figure, feeling the weight of its presence crushing her, she understood all too well. The promise had been to never turn away, to never try to escape. She had broken that promise. And now there was no way out. The figure reached forward, its hand long and clawed, its fingers stretching toward her. The moment it touched her, she felt her body freeze, her mind trapped in a vice of terror. "You belong to me now," the figure whispered, its voice a dark, suffocating presence. And as Anna's world went black, as the abyss swallowed her whole, she knew one terrifying truth. There was no escape. She was part of the darkness now. Anna's vision came back in a flash, though it wasn't her own eyes that she opened. Her body didn't belong to her anymore. The darkness had taken root inside her, consuming her, and with it came an overwhelming sense of weight and power. She could feel it, the ancient force coursing through her veins like ice, but at the same time, there was a sickening warmth, as if the figure had marked her as its own. Her surroundings had changed once again. No longer was she standing in the middle of the blizzard, fighting for breath against the crushing cold. She was in a cavern, deep beneath the earth, where the air was thick and oppressive, and the walls pulsed with an eerie red glow. The ground was slick with something wet, sticky, and black. It had a nauseating scent to it, like rotting flesh mixed with the stench of decay. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though she were walking through molasses. Her first instinct was to scream, to cry out for help, but the voice that came out of her mouth wasn't hers. It was the voice of the figure, deep and guttural, like it had taken over her very being. "You will stay here," the voice whispered, its words vibrating through her chest. Anna tried to move, tried to regain control, but it was useless. The entity inside her had a firm grip, like iron chains binding her to this place. She looked around the cavern, her breath quickening. The walls were covered in dark runes, symbols that made her skin crawl as she recognized them. They were the same markings she had seen etched into the walls of the shed, the same ones that had haunted her dreams. Something was coming, and it was worse than anything she had encountered so far. The ground shook again, this time violently, causing the walls of the cavern to tremble and crack. Anna's legs gave out beneath her as the force of the quake hit, and she fell to the wet, sticky floor. The black substance on the ground began to bubble, and Anna's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what it was. It wasn't just wetness. It was blood, and it was rising. Her body refused to move. Her limbs were stiff, as if they had become part of the dark force that surrounded her. She was trapped in this nightmare, a puppet under the control of something ancient and malevolent. As the blood began to rise, the cavern filled with a low, chanting hum. The walls seemed to ripple, and the runes glowed brighter, pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. "No," Anna tried to whisper, but the words were ripped from her throat, replaced by the sinister voice of the figure inside her. The blood reached her feet, and with it came an overwhelming sensation of dread. The floor beneath her began to crack, the cavern opening up as if it were alive, as if it were ready to consume her whole. The chanting grew louder, its cadence deafening as the walls began to close in on her. And then she saw it. A figure, tall and shrouded in shadow, appeared at the far end of the cavern. Its red eyes burned with an intensity that pierced through the darkness, and for a brief moment she could hear its footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure didn't speak at first. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on Anna as if it were waiting for something, some sign, some signal that she was ready. Anna's breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't just the figure that stood before her. Behind it, the air seemed to ripple and distort, as if something was tearing through the fabric of reality itself. Then, without warning, the figure spoke. "Anna, you've broken the rules." The voice was soft, but the words were like daggers, piercing into her soul. "You've opened the door." Anna didn't understand. She didn't know what door he was talking about, what rules she had broken. All she knew was that she was trapped in this nightmare, and it was getting worse with every passing second. "Don't you remember?" the figure asked again, its voice dripping with malice. "The promise you made. You knew this day would come." The memory hit her with the force of a crashing wave. It wasn't just the figure she had made the promise to. It was the darkness itself. The thing that had been waiting for her, watching her for years. Her father's warning. The promise to never run, to never look away. And now it was all coming to a head. The blood rising from the ground, the chanting, the figure. This was the consequence of breaking that promise. The blood rose higher, reaching her knees, then her waist, until it swallowed her whole. She could feel it seeping into her skin, dragging her deeper into the abyss. Her body fought, her mind screamed for freedom, but it was futile. The blood was part of the darkness, and the darkness was part of her. The walls of the cavern closed in, the chanting now a deafening roar. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing larger and more imposing. It was no longer just a shadow, it was a nightmare-given form, and it was coming for her. "Now you will fulfill your promise," the figure whispered, its voice filled with cruel satisfaction. Anna felt herself being dragged toward it, her body unwillingly moving forward as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. She couldn't fight it. The blood was everywhere now, coating her skin, filling her lungs with its thick, suffocating presence. And then the figure's hand reached out, its cold, clammy fingers wrapping around her wrist. The touch was like ice, burning into her flesh, marking her as its own. "Anna," the figure said softly, its voice almost tender, "you're mine now. And you always will be." With that, the world around her exploded into darkness. Anna's body felt like it was floating in a void, weightless, untethered to anything that made sense. The world around her was pitch black, as if the darkness itself had become her reality. She tried to move, but there was nothing to push against, nothing to hold on to. Her limbs felt heavy, numb, as though they no longer belonged to her. Her thoughts, scattered and broken, couldn't form into coherent words. For what felt like an eternity, she drifted. There was no sense of time in this place, no sound, no light. It was as if she had been swallowed by the earth itself, consumed by the very force she had tried to escape. Then a voice broke through the silence, a whisper so faint that at first she wasn't sure if it was real. "Anna?" The voice was familiar, but distorted, as if coming from the deepest part of her subconscious. She tried to focus, to latch onto the sound, but it faded before she could fully understand. "Anna?" The voice was stronger this time. There was a desperation in it, a sorrow that cut through the endless black. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. There was no direction in this empty space, no up or down, no left or right. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. But it was there, pulling her, calling her name with a kind of frantic urgency. Suddenly, a burst of coldness pierced the void. It hit her like a physical blow, sharp and biting, and with it came a flood of memories. Memories that had been locked away for years, buried beneath the weight of time and fear. Her father's face, pale and stricken with fear, his voice trembling as he spoke to her on that fateful Christmas Eve. His warnings, his pleas. The figure. The darkness. The promise. "Anna, you must understand." The voice wasn't her father's anymore. It was a different one that she couldn't place. A voice that seemed to echo from all around her, from the depths of the void itself. "You broke the promise." The voice was filled with grief. "Now you must face the consequences." The words made her pulse quicken. The promise, the one she had broken. It all came flooding back, as if the void itself was forcing her to confront the truth. She had broken the promise. She had turned away when she was told never to. She had run when she should have stayed. Now there was no escaping it. The coldness deepened, sinking into her bones, and with it came a terrible pressure, a weight that pushed down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She couldn't see anything, only darkness, but she felt it. The thing that was watching her, waiting for her to realize what she had done. "You cannot hide anymore," the voice continued. "It's too late." The pressure increased, as if the very air around her was being sucked out, leaving her gasping for breath. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. There was only the weight, the overwhelming sense of dread, and the echo of the voice that seemed to seep into her very soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness shifted. The void around her began to crack, a sharp, violent sound that reverberated through the silence. Light, harsh and blinding, began to break through the cracks, slicing through the darkness like a knife. Anna's heart raced. She didn't know what was happening, didn't know if she was being freed or drawn deeper into the nightmare. But she could feel it. The presence was drawing nearer, and whatever it was far worse than she could ever have imagined. The cracks widened, and with it the air seemed to grow heavier. The pressure on her chest was unbearable now, the sense of something huge and monstrous looming over her, waiting to strike. She could feel it, the way it was moving toward her, inching closer and closer until it was right on top of her. And then the light exploded into full brightness. For a split second, everything was blinding white, and Anna was overwhelmed by the intensity. But as the light faded, she found herself standing once again, her body whole but trembling. She was no longer in the void, no longer suspended in that empty space. She was back in the cabin. The familiar wooden walls. The cold wind that seeped through the cracks. The small, dimly lit room where she had once sat with her father, listening to his warnings, unaware of what was to come. But this time, everything was different. The room was wrong. The walls were covered in dark stains, the air thick with the scent of decay. The furniture was broken, torn apart as if something had violently ransacked the place. The warmth that had once filled the cabin was gone, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating chill. Anna looked down at her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her fingers trembled as they curled into fists. It wasn't her body anymore. It couldn't be. Something was horribly wrong. The figure was here. She could feel it even before she saw it. From the corner of the room, a shadow stirred. It moved with unnatural speed, its form shifting and twisting as it emerged into the dim light. The red eyes, the cold, cruel gaze, the towering presence that made her blood run cold. It was here, standing in the very room she had tried to escape. "You've come back," the figure said, its voice low and menacing. "And now you will pay the price." Anna's throat tightened, her mind racing for any escape, any way to break free from this nightmare. But there was no escape. There never had been. "You broke the promise," the figure repeated, its voice almost a chant now, echoing in the room. "And now you belong to me." Anna's legs gave out beneath her, and she fell to her knees, the weight of everything crashing down on her at once. The fear, the realization, the hopelessness. She had broken the promise. And now she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. The figure moved closer, its shadow swallowing the room whole, its presence overwhelming. It reached out, its cold hand grazing her cheek, and Anna's skin burned where it touched her. And then, in that final, crushing moment, she understood. There was no way out. There had never been. She had sealed her fate long ago. The coldness of the figure's touch lingered on Anna's skin, like ice seeping into her very bones. She could feel its presence all around her, pressing in from every direction. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of its power. The room, once familiar and comforting, was now a prison, a cage designed to break her spirit. The figure's eyes, glowing red like twin embers, bore into her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. There was no pity in them, no remorse. It didn't care who she was, what she had been, or what she had lost. All that mattered now was that she was here and she had broken the promise. "You think you can run from me?" the figure hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "You think you can escape your fate?" Anna's breath caught in her throat, the fear choking her. She had tried to escape. She had run. She had thought, for just a fleeting moment, that she could outrun whatever haunted her. But now, in the presence of the figure, she realized how foolish she had been. The figure stepped forward, its shadow swallowing the room. It was impossibly tall, its form shifting and writhing like something not quite human. It moved with an unnatural grace, its long clawed fingers reaching for her, its body stretching and warping with each step it took. Anna scrambled back, her heart racing in her chest. She tried to stand, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The fear was paralyzing, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, stealing all the air from her lungs. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. She couldn't escape. The figure's cold laughter echoed through the room, a sound that was both terrifying and maddening. "You should have stayed away. You should have listened to the warnings." Anna could feel the weight of its words settling in her mind, sinking deep into her thoughts. She should have listened. She should have stayed in the warmth of her home, in the safety of the world she had known. But she hadn't. She had chosen to run, to defy the warning, to challenge the thing that had waited for her. And now here she was, trapped. With a sudden, jerking motion, the figure reached out, its clawed fingers wrapping around her wrist. Anna gasped, her body shaking uncontrollably as the coldness of its touch burned into her skin. It pulled her closer, dragging her toward it with terrifying strength. Her feet scraped against the floor, but she couldn't free herself. The figure was too strong, too powerful. "Why do you fight?" it whispered, its voice now soothing, almost tender. "You are mine, Anna. You always were." Tears welled up in Anna's eyes as she struggled to break free, but the more she fought, the tighter its grip became. She could feel her strength draining away, as if the very life was being sucked from her with each passing second. "No," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. I won't belong to you." The figure's laughter returned, louder this time, reverberating in the small cabin like a maddening sound. It was the laugh of something ancient, something that had seen and done things that no one should ever have to imagine. "You already do," it hissed. "You always have." The words echoed in Anna's mind as her vision blurred, the edges of reality slipping away from her. She tried to hold on to herself, to the memory of who she was, but it was like trying to grasp water with her bare hands. The more she tried to hold on, the more it slipped away. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the figure released her. She fell to the floor, her body hitting the ground with a thud. The coldness of the room seemed to recede slightly, but the darkness still clung to her like a second skin. Anna's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She couldn't move, couldn't think. All she could do was lie there, paralyzed by fear, by the overwhelming knowledge that she was trapped. There was no escape. But then something shifted. A crack appeared in the darkness, a faint light shining through. It was weak at first, barely noticeable, but as Anna focused on it, it grew brighter, stronger. It was coming from the far corner of the room. Slowly, with every ounce of strength she had left, Anna pushed herself to her feet. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she forced herself to move. The light in the corner was calling to her, beckoning her forward. It wasn't much, but it was something, a sign that there was still a chance, a glimmer of hope in this endless nightmare. She stumbled toward the light, her body trembling with exhaustion, with fear. The figure watched her from the shadows, its eyes glowing with a sickening hunger, but Anna didn't stop. She couldn't. The closer she got to the light, the more she felt the pressure around her chest lift, as if the darkness were retreating. The shadows that had once consumed the room seemed to shrink away from the light, recoiling from it like a living thing. But the figure didn't move. It stayed where it was, watching her every step. Anna reached the source of the light and found herself standing before an old wooden door. The light spilled out from the crack beneath it, brighter than anything she had seen before. It was the only thing in the room that wasn't covered in darkness, the only thing that seemed real. Without thinking, she reached for the door, her hand trembling as she grasped the cold, rusted handle. She twisted it, and the door creaked open, revealing a blinding white light on the other side. But just as she was about to step through, the figure's voice stopped her. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice low and menacing. "There is no escape. You belong to me." Anna froze, her hand still on the door handle. The words echoed in her mind, threatening to pull her back into the abyss. But she couldn't give in. Not now. She took a deep breath, her heart racing, and stepped through the door into the blinding light. As she crossed the threshold, everything went silent. The world around her disappeared, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm, as if she were being wrapped in the softest blanket of peace. For a brief moment, she wondered if this was it, if she had finally found her escape. But something told her that this wasn't the end. Something told her that the worst was yet to come. Anna stepped through the door, feeling the light envelop her in its soft embrace. It wasn't like the harsh, blinding light she had seen before. It was warm, calming, almost comforting. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, her body sinking into the warmth of the light. It was as though the very air around her was alive, gently caressing her skin, offering a respite from the terror that had gripped her for so long. But just as quickly as the warmth came, it faded. The light flickered, like a candle struggling to stay lit in the wind. The soothing atmosphere she had felt moments ago began to twist, warping into something darker, something more ominous. The floor beneath her feet gave way to a deep, inky blackness, and Anna stumbled, her heart racing. The comforting light was now just a memory, fading in the distance as she was swallowed by the shadows. Panic surged through her as she reached out, trying to find something solid, something that could anchor her in this nightmare. But there was nothing. "Anna?" The voice again. The same voice she had heard before. Only this time it was different. There was no softness, no tenderness in it. It was cold, cruel, and filled with an anger she could feel deep within her chest. "Anna?" The voice called again, closer now, its tone sharpening, like the sound of a knife slicing through the silence. She spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was no one there. Just darkness, stretching endlessly in every direction. The voice was everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it. The presence. The thing that had been hunting her. It was near, and this time she could feel its malice, its hunger, its rage. "Do you think you can escape me?" The voice whispered, its tone a low growl. "You cannot run. You will never be free." The words echoed in her mind, each one heavier than the last, sinking into her soul. Anna's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The weight of the darkness pressed down on her, suffocating her, making it hard to think, to breathe, to move. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, I don't want this." But the voice didn't respond. Instead, she felt a cold hand touch her shoulder, its grip tight and unforgiving. She flinched, the icy fingers sending a jolt of terror through her. She didn't have to look to know what was behind her. She could feel it, the twisted, monstrous thing that had been stalking her, waiting for the right moment to strike. A shiver ran down her spine as the hand slid down her arm, its touch like ice, leaving a trail of coldness in its wake. She could feel its breath on the back of her neck, hot and foul, like the air of a tomb. "You're mine now, Anna," the voice whispered in her ear. "You always have been." A wave of nausea washed over her, and she fought to hold back the bile rising in her throat. She tried to push herself up, to move away, but her body refused to cooperate. She was paralyzed, trapped, unable to escape the suffocating grip of the thing that haunted her. And then, just when she thought she couldn't bear it anymore, the darkness parted, and a figure emerged from the shadows. Anna's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. The figure from her past, the one that had been there all along. The one who had watched her from the shadows, waiting for this moment. It was her father. But he wasn't the same. His eyes were hollow, dark circles beneath them like he hadn't slept in years. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over the bones. He looked as if he had been drained of everything that made him human, his body a shell of what it once was. "Daddy," Anna whispered, her voice barely audible, barely a breath. "What's happening? What is this?" Her father's lips twisted into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was twisted, mocking, as if he found her confusion and fear amusing. His eyes flickered, and for a moment, Anna thought she saw something else, something darker, something not quite human. "You shouldn't have come back, Anna," he said, his voice hollow and distant. "This is the price you pay for breaking the promise." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she gasped, her chest tightening. The promise? She had forgotten. She had tried to forget. But now, in the presence of this twisted version of her father, she remembered. The promise her father had made her swear, the one she had broken without even realizing the consequences. The one that had led her here to this nightmare. Anna shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Her father's laugh was hollow, cruel as he stepped closer, his form becoming more and more distorted. It was as if his body was warping before her eyes, twisting and stretching like a nightmare made flesh. "You didn't mean to?" he repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You didn't mean to? But you did, Anna. You did. And now there's no turning back." Anna's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing for any way to escape. But the more she tried to move, the more she felt the weight of the darkness pulling her down, sinking her deeper into the abyss. Her father's form loomed over her, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You've come too far," he said, his voice growing louder, more menacing. "You've crossed the line. And now you belong to me." With a sudden jerk, he reached out, grabbing Anna by the arm and pulling her toward him. She struggled, her body shaking with fear, but she was powerless to break free. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The darkness, the figure, her father, it all vanished in an instant, leaving her standing in an empty room. The air was still, the silence deafening. Anna blinked, her mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? Or was she still trapped in some twisted dream? She looked around, her heart racing, but there was no sign of the figure. No sign of the darkness that had consumed her. It was as if it had all been some terrible illusion. But deep down, Anna knew the truth. It wasn't over. The nightmare wasn't finished with her yet. The silence was suffocating. Anna stood in the middle of the room, her breath shallow, her pulse thundering in her ears. Everything was still. Too still. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, but the unease that clung to her skin wouldn't let go. Her eyes darted around, searching for any hint of the horrors she had just witnessed. The twisted figure of her father, the icy grip of whatever had haunted her, it was gone, vanished like a fleeting nightmare. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her still, waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of this strange, quiet world. She took a step forward, her feet barely making a sound on the floor. The room was bare, its walls cold and unyielding. There were no windows, no doors, nothing that could offer an escape. It was just her and the silence. A sharp chill cut through the air and Anna froze. It wasn't the cold that had numbed her body earlier, but a new kind of cold, one that sank into her very soul. She could feel it creeping up her spine, sending a shiver through her limbs. Her fingers twitched, her mind racing. Was she really free from the thing that had tormented her, or was this just another trick? Another layer to the nightmare that she could never escape? "You're still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt stupid as soon as they left her mouth. Of course she was still here. But in some strange, twisted way, the silence made it feel like she wasn't alone. The air felt thick with something dark, like the walls themselves were alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She needed to get out. She needed to find a way out of this place before it swallowed her whole. But where? There was no sign of the door she had entered through. No windows, no exit. Just the endless, suffocating stillness. Her pulse quickened as she turned in a slow circle, her eyes scanning every inch of the room. But no matter how many times she looked, nothing changed. It was the same, empty, cold, lifeless. Then she heard it. A faint sound, barely a whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was almost like breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. Anna's heart skipped a beat. The sound came again, louder this time, and Anna's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, frozen, her eyes wide with fear as the sound grew louder and more distinct. The walls, they were alive. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out, to find an escape. But her legs wouldn't move. They were rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was holding her in place. And then she saw it. A shadow. It wasn't much at first, just a flicker in the corner of her vision. But as she turned her head, it grew, stretching across the floor, creeping up the walls. It was like a living thing, twisting and writhing, expanding with every passing second. Anna's throat tightened, her hands clammy as she reached out for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Nothing to grasp. Nothing to anchor her in this nightmare. The shadow grew larger, more solid, until it formed a shape, a figure. A tall, menacing figure shrouded in darkness. Its face was obscured, hidden in the shadows, but Anna could feel its presence. It was the same feeling she had experienced before, the weight of something ancient, something powerful, standing just out of reach. It was watching her. The figure took a step forward, its form slowly becoming clearer, more defined. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long, stretching as if they didn't belong in this world. And with each step it took, the temperature in the room dropped, the air growing colder, heavier. Anna's breath caught in her throat as the figure reached out with a long, twisted hand. Its fingers were impossibly long, sharp like knives, and they scraped across the floor as it moved closer to her. "No," Anna whispered, taking a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, no." The figure's head tilted, as if it were curious about her reaction. Its eyes, hidden in the shadow, seemed to glow, faintly at first, like two distant stars on the edge of a nightmare. "You can't escape me, Anna," it whispered, its voice cold and deep, echoing through the room like a distant memory. "Not now. Not ever." The word struck her like a punch to the gut. The same voice she had heard before. The one that had haunted her dreams, her waking hours, always just out of reach. And now here it was, standing before her, in the flesh. Or whatever it was. This thing, this nightmare, was real. Anna's body trembled with terror, but she refused to show fear. She had fought this thing before. She had survived it. She could do it again. But as she steeled herself, the figure moved closer, its presence pressing in on her, filling the room with an unbearable weight. It was as if the very air itself was being sucked into the figure, draining her of her will to fight. "You think you can outrun me?" the figure hissed. "You think you can break free of this? You belong to me, Anna. You always have." The words were suffocating, like a vice closing around her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could do was stand there, staring at the thing that was slowly, relentlessly, drawing her into its grasp. Her heart raced as she felt the darkness wrap around her, a cold, suffocating embrace that threatened to crush her. She couldn't fight it. She couldn't fight this thing. It was too powerful. Too much. And then, in a moment of clarity, something inside her snapped. She wasn't alone. The light, the warmth, the promise of safety. Anna's mind reeled back to that moment, that crack in the darkness she had seen earlier. The faint light that had given her hope. She wasn't trapped here forever. She wasn't going to let this thing win. With a scream, Anna reached out, her hand brushing against the figure's cold, outstretched fingers. It felt like fire against her skin, like an electric shock running through her veins, but she didn't pull back. She pressed forward, forcing her body to move, to fight. "You will not have me," Anna snarled, her voice shaking but determined. "Not this time." The figure hesitated, its grip faltering as she pushed against it. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. She needed more. Her mind screamed at her to find the strength, to reach deep down and pull out everything she had left. And then, with every ounce of willpower she had left, Anna pushed. Light exploded around her, blinding, pure. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into the light, its shadow vanishing like smoke in the wind. And then, silence. Anna stood alone in the empty room once more, the light fading as the darkness slowly began to recede. It wasn't over, but for now she had won. The air around Anna felt thick, almost suffocating. The light had faded, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The weight of something lurking just beyond the veil of her awareness. The darkness had retreated, temporarily at least, but something darker was stirring, something deeper than before. Anna's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she took cautious steps forward. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of everything that had happened. The figure, her father's twisted version, the promises she had broken, everything was connected. But how? What did it all mean? Her hands trembled as she reached for the wall, her fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. She wanted to scream. She wanted to break free from this nightmare. But she knew she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she understood what was happening. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. It wasn't a tremor, not an earthquake, but something more subtle, more sinister. A vibration, low and constant, like the hum of a distant engine. It was there, vibrating through the floorboards, the walls, the very air she breathed. The sound gnawed at her ears as if the room itself were alive, whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. Anna's breath quickened. She had to find a way out. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let herself be consumed by whatever was haunting her. She needed answers. And more than that, she needed control. Control over the fear that gripped her heart, control over the terror that threatened to swallow her whole. The room seemed to stretch around her, the walls growing taller, the shadows deeper. The darkness was returning, creeping in from the edges, folding over itself like a living thing. It was as if the very air was closing in, pressing on her chest, making it harder to breathe. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't let you do this." Her voice barely broke the silence, but the words felt like a defiant shout, an act of resistance against the crushing force that threatened to take over her mind. The darkness faltered, just for a moment, as if surprised by her strength. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. The hum from the walls grew louder, more insistent. And then something shifted, something unnatural. The air crackled with energy, and Anna felt it, felt the change in the atmosphere as if the very fabric of reality was warping around her. She turned, her eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of movement, any clue that would tell her where to go next. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was something else, something wrong. It was like a silhouette, a shadow that moved and breathed, but it wasn't alive. Not in the way she understood life. It was something older, something beyond the human world. The figure shifted, its outline flickering like a candle flame in the wind. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, stretching out of proportion. Its face was obscured by a dark, shifting fog, but Anna could feel its eyes on her, watching her, studying her every move. Her stomach twisted into knots. She had to fight. She had to face whatever this thing was. But how? What was it? And why was it here? The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Anna's heart pounded in her chest, and she took an instinctive step back. The shadows around the figure seemed to grow, expanding like a dark fog, slowly consuming the room. The air grew colder, the very temperature of the room dropping with every step the figure took. Anna shivered, pulling her arms around herself in an attempt to ward off the sudden chill, but it wasn't enough. The cold was beyond physical. It was a deep, biting cold that seemed to seep into her bones, into her soul. "You shouldn't be here," the figure's voice rasped, deep and hollow. It wasn't a voice she recognized, but somehow it felt familiar, like something buried deep in her subconscious, something she had once known but had long since forgotten. Anna swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice shook. "What do you want from me?" The figure's lips curled into a smile, though it was more of a sneer. "What do I want? That's the wrong question, Anna. The question is, what will you do now that you know the truth?" Truth? Anna's mind raced. What truth? What was the figure talking about? She had learned nothing. The terror, the twisted version of her father, the promises, it was all a blur, a nightmare without answers. The figure moved closer, its shadow stretching toward her, wrapping around her like a physical presence, smothering her in its dark, oppressive grip. "You've already made your choice," it continued, its voice like gravel, scraping against her nerves. "You've already crossed the line. There's no going back now." Anna's breath caught in her throat. She had crossed the line? What line? What did that even mean? "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, tell me what's happening." The figure's shadow seemed to pulse, expanding and contracting like a living thing. "You are a part of something much bigger than you realize," it said, its voice now tinged with something like amusement. "The choices you make, they all have consequences. And you, Anna, have just begun to feel the weight of yours." A wave of dread washed over her, and she took another step back, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure was now standing right in front of her. She could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on her, making it harder to think, to breathe. "I want nothing," it replied softly, almost tenderly. "I want you to face what you've done. The broken promises, the choices. They're all coming for you, Anna. And when they do, there will be no escape." The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping and twisting as the figure's words echoed in her mind, reverberating like a death knell. Anna's legs buckled beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her hands gripping the cold surface beneath her. She could feel it now, the weight of everything she had done, everything she had tried to escape. It was closing in, and there was no way out. "No, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the figure wasn't listening. It simply stood there, watching her, its face hidden in the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unsettling hunger. "You're mine now," it said, its voice low and final. And then the room was swallowed by darkness. The darkness was absolute. Anna's heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, but the air felt thin, suffocating. Her thoughts were a blur of panic, each one trying to break free from the fog of fear that had overtaken her. She tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the suffocating blackness that surrounded her. It wasn't just a lack of light, it was a void, a place where even sound seemed to vanish. She couldn't see her hands in front of her face, but she could feel the cold creeping up her arms, the air turning to ice with each passing second. Every breath she drew was like inhaling shards of glass, sharp and painful. "Is this it?" she thought desperately. "Is this where it ends?" The figure, the thing that had tormented her for so long, had disappeared into the void with her. Its voice, cold and final, still echoed in her mind. "You're mine now." The words cut through her like a blade, and the weight of them threatened to crush her. She could feel its presence still, lurking just beyond the reach of her awareness, like a shadow that would never leave. She wasn't alone. Not really. A sudden, blinding flash of light pierced the darkness. It was so bright that it hurt her eyes, searing through the black like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. Anna's body tensed instinctively, her hands shielding her eyes as she recoiled from the light. "Eno," she screamed, her voice hoarse and desperate. "I won't let you take me." But the light only grew stronger. It swirled around her like a vortex, pulling at her skin, her very soul. She tried to fight it, but it was useless. The force was too strong. The darkness was too consuming. It was as if the light and the darkness were at war, battling for control of her mind. "You can't fight it, Anna," the figure's voice came again, though this time it seemed distant, fading in and out, as if it were speaking from a faraway place. "It's already too late." Anna's chest tightened. The cold, the fear, It was all consuming, drowning her. And yet, deep within the chaos, a strange clarity began to form. The voice, the figure, it wasn't all powerful. It was a part of her. A manifestation of her darkest fears, her regrets, her failures. She had spent so long running from it, trying to escape the inevitable, but maybe it wasn't about escaping at all. Maybe it was about confronting it, facing the truth no matter how ugly it was. The light began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, slow at first, then building in intensity. With every pulse, Anna could feel the darkness recoil, pushing back just a little more. She closed her eyes tightly, focusing on the steady thrum of the light, letting it fill her mind, pushing aside the whispers of the shadow. "You're not my master," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady. "You don't control me." For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just an overwhelming, suffocating silence. And then, crack. The light shattered like glass, exploding outward in all directions. The darkness shrieked, an inhuman guttural sound that reverberated through the air. Anna gasped, her heart racing as the last remnants of the shadow crumbled away. The oppressive weight that had been crushing her chest lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking in the sudden brightness. The darkness was gone. The figure was gone. But she wasn't alone. The room had changed. The walls were no longer the cold, unyielding structures they had been. Now they were warm, alive. The air, once stale and heavy, was fresh, light, as if the entire room had been cleansed of its torment. A faint golden glow filled the space, and in the center there was a door. Anna's heart skipped a beat. She didn't understand it, but she knew it. The door was the way out. The way back to the world she knew. The world she had been fighting to return to. She took a hesitant step toward it, her feet light, as though the weight of her fear had been lifted from her legs. With each step, she felt stronger, more confident, as though the very air was feeding her strength. The closer she got, the more real the door seemed. It wasn't an illusion. It was tangible. It was a choice she had to make. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling just slightly as she touched the cool metal. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing stood out. She had faced the darkness. She had confronted her fears, her deepest regrets. And in doing so, she had survived. With a final, steadying breath, she turned the handle. The door opened. But as the door swung wide, something inside her faltered. The familiar world she had hoped to return to wasn't waiting on the other side. Instead, there was a bright, white expanse stretching endlessly in every direction. No walls, no boundaries, no sky, just endless white. Anna stepped forward, but the floor beneath her was soft, like a thick mist, and it rippled as if it were alive, as if it were watching her, reacting to her every movement. "Is this real?" she whispered, stepping farther into the void. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening thud, and she spun around, but there was no sign of it. The white space was all-consuming, yet somehow empty. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet, nor the air around her. It was as if she was floating in a vacuum. But she wasn't alone. Again she could feel the presence. It was watching her, waiting. And then the voice spoke again. "You've made your choice, Anna," it whispered, soft and cold, just like before. "But there is no escape." She knew that voice. She knew it all too well. And this time there was no escape. The snow wasn't supposed to be red. But there it was, beneath the glow of the Christmas lights, glittering like shattered rubies. It wasn't just a small stain either. It seemed to stretch further now, a haunting contrast against the pristine white blanket covering the neighborhood. No one in the neighborhood noticed it at first. They were too busy with their holiday cheer, stringing up lights, singing carols, and wrapping gifts. It was Christmas Eve after all. But Sarah noticed. She stood by her frosted window, staring out into the chilling darkness, her breath forming small clouds against the glass. Her heart felt heavy, weighed down by a growing sense of unease she couldn't explain. This was supposed to be her favorite time of year, but something felt wrong. She glanced at the glowing Christmas tree in the corner of the room, its colorful lights flickering cheerfully. The contrast was jarring. The warmth of her home felt like a fragile bubble, surrounded by a creeping, icy tension from outside. "Mom?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling just enough for her to notice. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming along to Silent Night as she worked on the turkey. The comforting aroma of roasted meat and spices filled the house. but it did little to soothe Sarah's growing discomfort. "What is it, honey?" her mother replied without looking up, her tone light and distracted. Sarah hesitated. "There's something weird outside." Her mother finally wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and came over, brushing a stray curl from her face. She peered out the window, her expression curious. "What do you mean? Everything looks fine." Sarah pointed toward the far end of their yard, where the crimson snow glistened ominously. "It's not fine. Look over there. That's blood." Her mother frowned, squinting. "Don't be silly, Sarah. It's probably some berries or maybe a stray animal got hurt. It's nothing to worry about. Go help Danny with the decorations." Sarah didn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the crimson stain, and as she stared, a chill ran down her spine. The patch of red seemed to have spread, just slightly but enough for her to notice. It was inching closer to the edge of their driveway. And then she heard it. Crunch. Her stomach dropped. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on snow. "Mom, listen," Sarah whispered urgently. Her mother sighed. "Sarah, you're imagining things. Don't let your mind run wild. It's Christmas Eve, not Halloween. Let's focus on the good stuff." She kissed Sarah's forehead and returned to the kitchen. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She pressed her face closer to the glass, her breath fogging up the pain. The footsteps came again, louder this time. Slow, deliberate. She turned toward the kitchen. "Mom, I'm going outside to check." "What?" "No, you're not," her mother called back, but Sarah was already grabbing her coat and boots. The icy air hit her like a slap as she stepped onto the porch. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The snow under her boots crunched softly as she moved toward the edge of the lawn, her breath visible in the freezing air. Up close, the patch of red was even more disturbing. It wasn't just a surface stain, it soaked through the snow entirely, as if someone or something had bled out here. Her stomach churned as she crouched down and reached out a hesitant hand to brush some of it away. Underneath, she found a piece of torn fabric. It was dark, almost black, stiff with dried blood. "What the?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her fingers trembled as she held up the fabric, trying to make sense of it. That's when she heard the sound. A faint jingling. It wasn't the cheerful kind of jingling like bells on a sleigh. It was hollow, distorted, wrong. The sound seemed to echo around her, growing louder, closer. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The street was empty, the windows of every house glowing warmly. But just beyond the edge of her yard, near the line of trees at the far end of the property, she saw it. A shadow. It was tall, impossibly tall, and unnaturally thin. The way it moved sent a shiver through her body. It didn't walk like a person. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Who's there?" Sarah shouted, though her voice wavered. The shadow froze. For a moment, everything was still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then it moved. Not toward her, but sideways, slipping between the trees with a speed that made Sarah's head spin. She stumbled backward, clutching the bloody fabric as if it were a shield. Her legs felt weak, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Sarah." Her mother's voice snapped her back to reality. She turned and bolted for the house, the icy air burning her lungs as she ran. Inside, she slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. "Sarah, what's gotten into you?" her mother demanded, hurrying over. "There's something out there," Sarah gasped. "Something watching us." Her little brother Danny peered at her from the living room, his face pale and frightened. He clutched his favorite stuffed bear, his wide eyes filled with fear. "Don't scare your brother," her mother scolded, though her own voice carried a hint of worry. The lights flickered once, twice. Then the house was plunged into darkness. Danny screamed, and Sarah's mother grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, clicking it on. The beam of light illuminated their frightened faces, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. "What's happening?" Danny whimpered. "I don't know," their mother said, her voice shaky now. "But we're fine. Everyone stay calm." Sarah moved back to the window, her heart racing. The street lights were out, and the entire neighborhood was cloaked in shadow. But outside, something was changing. The snow wasn't just red anymore. It was spreading, an ominous, crimson tide creeping closer to their house. And then she heard it again. The jingling. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was loud, echoing, and unmistakably close. The jingling grew louder, carrying an unsettling rhythm that didn't match anything Sarah had ever heard before. It wasn't cheerful or festive. It was jagged, broken, as if something was dragging chains across the icy ground outside. Her mother gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam trembling as she pointed it toward the front door. Danny whimpered, clutching Sarah's arm like a lifeline. "Mom, what's that sound?" he whispered. "I don't know," her mother replied, her voice unsteady. "Probably the wind, or some loose decorations." Sarah knew better. She stepped closer to the window, peering into the inky blackness. The glow of the Christmas lights from the tree behind her cast just enough illumination to make out the faintest movement in the yard. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice low but urgent. "We need to stay away from the windows." Her mother turned to her sharply. "Sarah, stop scaring your brother. You're making this worse." The jingling stopped. For a brief moment, silence blanketed the house, heavier than the snow outside. Even the wind seemed to die down, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate thud against the front door. Sarah froze, her blood running cold. Her mother spun toward the sound, her flashlight aimed at the door. Danny whimpered louder, burying his face in Sarah's side. "Who could that be at this hour?" her mother muttered, trying to sound calm but failing. "It's not Santa," Sarah said, unable to stop the words from tumbling out. Her mother shot her a look but didn't respond. Instead, she approached the door cautiously, every step echoing loudly in the tense silence. "Mom, don't," Sarah hissed. "It's probably just a neighbor," her mother said, though her voice betrayed her doubt. "Maybe someone's car broke down." She reached for the doorknob, but Sarah grabbed her arm. "Please don't open it." Her mother hesitated, staring at Sarah. The fear in her daughter's eyes gave her pause, but she shook it off and gently pushed Sarah's hand away. "Stay back," she said firmly. She unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and something metallic. "Hello?" she called out. There was no answer. "Is someone there?" The flashlight beam swept across the yard, revealing nothing but the red-streaked snow and the dark outline of the woods beyond. Her mother exhaled and started to close the door. "See? Nothing. Just your imagination, Sarah." Bang. The door slammed inward, knocking her backward. The flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning wildly and casting chaotic beams of light around the room. Danny screamed, and Sarah's mother scrambled to her feet, slamming the door shut again with all her strength. She locked it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "What was that?" Danny cried. "I don't know," their mother shouted, her voice cracking. Sarah rushed to grab the flashlight, holding it steady as she aimed it at the door. For a moment, they all stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the trembling wood. Whatever had slammed into it wasn't knocking anymore, but the jingling had returned. It circled the house now, moving from the front door to the side windows. Sarah turned, her heart pounding, as the sound grew louder on the other side of the wall. "It's moving," she whispered. "It's trying to get in." Her mother grabbed the landline phone from the counter, but when she brought it to her ear, she froze. "There's no dial tone." "What?" Sarah's voice rose. "How is that possible?" "I don't know," her mother snapped, slamming the phone down. The jingling stopped again, replaced by a new sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It reverberated through the walls, rattling the windows. Danny clung to Sarah, his small body trembling. "I'm scared," he whispered. "I know," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around him. "It's going to be okay. We're safe inside." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The growling stopped, and for a moment the silence returned. Sarah's mother moved toward the kitchen window, gripping the edge of the counter for support. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "I need to see what's out there," her mother replied, her voice barely audible. "Don't." Her mother pulled back the curtain, and Sarah saw her freeze, her face draining of color. "What is it?" Sarah demanded, but her mother didn't answer. She slowly stepped back from the window, her hands covering her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head. "Mom, what did you see?" Sarah asked again, panic rising in her voice. Her mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not human." Before Sarah could respond, the power flickered back on, flooding the house with light. But instead of relief, the brightness only made the situation worse. Now they could see the red streaks on the windows, smears of blood trailing down the glass as if someone, or something, had been clawing at it. The Christmas lights on the tree flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then the sound of jingling bells returned, louder than ever, accompanied by heavy, dragging footsteps. It was at the back door now. "Get upstairs," Sarah's mother said, her voice shaking. "Both of you. Now. Upstairs. Go," her mother shouted again, her voice more urgent this time. Sarah grabbed Danny's hand and pulled him toward the staircase, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Danny stumbled, tears streaming down his face, clutching his stuffed bear like it was the only thing keeping him safe. "Mom, come with us," Sarah cried out halfway up the stairs. "I will." "Just go," her mother yelled, her eyes darting between the back door and the windows, which were now streaked with bloody smears. The jingling bells were relentless, circling the house again, moving faster. The heavy footsteps followed, crunching through the snow outside with a weight that seemed impossible. Sarah reached the top of the stairs, dragging Danny into her bedroom. "Get under the bed," she instructed him, her voice trembling. "But I'm scared," Danny whimpered. "I know, but you'll be safe under there," Sarah said, crouching to push him underneath. She grabbed her heaviest blanket and threw it over the bed frame to hide him completely. "Don't come out until I say so, okay?" Danny nodded, his wide, tear-filled eyes barely visible beneath the edge of the blanket. Sarah stood up, her body shaking, and crept to the window. She peeked through the blinds, her breath fogging the glass. The backyard was a mess of trampled snow, the crimson streaks now forming a chaotic web of red trails that seemed to lead toward the woods. But then she saw it. A figure. It stood near the edge of the yard, impossibly tall and thin, its body cloaked in shadow. The only detail she could make out was the twisted antlers curling from its head and the faint glow of two eyes, reflecting the dim light like a predator's. Sarah's stomach turned as the creature tilted its head, as if it knew she was watching. She backed away from the window, her knees nearly buckling. "What is that thing?" she whispered to herself. Downstairs, her mother was frantically trying to call for help on her cell phone, but the screen only showed a spinning icon. No service. She cursed under her breath and grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. Another knock came, this time at the back door. Slow. Deliberate. Her mother froze, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scratching against the wood. She stepped closer, her heart racing. "Whoever you are, get out of here," she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. The scratching stopped. Then came the voice. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, and layered, like several voices speaking at once. "Let me in." Her mother staggered back, nearly dropping the knife. "No," she screamed. The creature outside let out a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills up her spine. Then the scratching resumed, faster this time, more frantic, as if it was trying to tear the door apart. Upstairs, Sarah heard the commotion and pressed her ear to the floor. "Mom," she shouted, but there was no reply. She turned to the bed, crouching down to check on Danny. "Stay here no matter what you hear, okay?" Danny nodded, his lips quivering. Sarah grabbed her metal desk lamp, the heaviest thing she could find, and crept out of the room. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the flickering Christmas tree downstairs. She gripped the lamp tightly, every muscle in her body tense. As she descended the stairs, the sounds grew louder, the scratching, the jingling bells, and the guttural voice repeating the same words. "Let me in." Her mother was pressed against the counter, the knife in her hand trembling. She looked up as Sarah reached the bottom of the stairs. "Sarah, I told you to stay upstairs. I couldn't leave you down here alone," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What is it? What's out there?" "I don't know," her mother admitted, her eyes darting to the back door. "But it's not getting in." The creature outside suddenly stopped scratching. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then the jingling began again, moving toward the windows. "Sarah, grab the flashlight," her mother said, nodding toward the counter. Sarah grabbed it, holding it up like a weapon. The light flickered as she aimed it at the windows, the beam trembling in her shaky hands. The voice came again, louder this time, as if it were right next to them. "Why won't you let me in?" The window nearest to them shattered. Glass exploded into the kitchen, the shards scattering across the floor like jagged ice. Sarah screamed, dropping the flashlight, which spun on the ground, casting erratic beams of light. A long, clawed hand reached through the broken window, its blackened skin glistening with something wet and foul-smelling. The claws scraped against the wall, leaving deep gashes in the paint. "Run!" her mother shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. They bolted toward the stairs, their footsteps pounding against the hardwood floor. Behind them, the creature roared, the sound vibrating through the house. Danny screamed from upstairs. "Danny?" Sarah cried, her heart lurching. They reached the top of the stairs and Sarah threw open her bedroom door. Danny was still under the bed, his tiny frame trembling. She pulled him out, hugging him tightly. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. Her mother slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, though the flimsy lock wouldn't hold for long. She pushed a dresser in front of the door, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, holding Danny close. Her mother didn't answer. She was staring at the window, her face pale. The creature was outside, its antlers scraping against the glass as it peered in. Its glowing eyes locked onto Sarah, and for the first time she saw its mouth, a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth, curled into a grotesque smile. Then it spoke again. "You can't hide." The room felt smaller with every passing second, the air heavy with the suffocating weight of fear. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as the creature's glowing eyes bore into hers, unblinking, predatory. Danny clung to her, burying his face in her chest, while their mother stood frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the dresser she had shoved against the door. The creature outside tilted its head again, the antlers scratching against the glass with a sound that made Sarah's teeth ache. Then it smiled wider, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth glistening in the faint light. It tapped on the window with one long clawed finger. Asterisk tap. Tap. Tap asterisk. Sarah's mother moved quickly, pulling the curtain closed, but the sound of tapping continued, each knock deliberate and mocking. "What does it want?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Her mother crouched next to her, gripping her shoulders. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not getting in here." The creature let out a guttural laugh, the sound reverberating through the walls like a low growl. Then the tapping stopped, and for a moment there was silence. The quiet stretched on, unnerving and unnatural. Danny whimpered, clutching Sarah's sweater tightly. "Is it gone?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No," Sarah replied, her eyes darting to the window. She could feel it, its presence lingering just outside, watching, waiting. The doorknob rattled suddenly, violently. The dresser shook as something slammed against the other side of the door, the force so strong it made the wood splinter slightly. "Get back!" their mother shouted, pulling Sarah and Danny away from the door. The pounding continued, each slam harder than the last. The creature roared again, its voice a mix of rage and triumph. Then, without warning, it stopped. Sarah blinked, her ears ringing in the sudden silence. The door stood battered but intact, the dresser still in place. "What's it doing now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Her mother didn't answer. She was staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide. Slowly, Sarah followed her gaze. The sound started softly, a faint creak of footsteps above them. "It's on the roof," her mother whispered. Danny started to cry, his sobs muffled as Sarah tried to calm him. "It's okay," she lied, stroking his hair. "We're safe. It can't get in here." But even as she said the words, doubt crept into her mind. The creaking grew louder, moving across the roof with purpose. It stopped directly above them, and for a moment, all they could hear was their own ragged breathing. Then came the scratching. It was slow, methodical, like nails being dragged across a chalkboard. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls, setting every nerve in Sarah's body on edge. Her mother grabbed the knife she had brought upstairs and positioned herself between the kids and the door. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. The scratching stopped, and then the window shattered. Glass sprayed across the room as the creature's hand burst through, its claws sinking into the wall. Sarah screamed, pulling Danny away as her mother lunged forward, slashing at the hand with the knife. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, yanking its arm back through the broken window. For a moment, there was silence again, but Sarah knew better than to think it was over. Her mother turned to her, breathing heavily. "We can't stay here. We need to get out." "How?" Sarah asked. "It's everywhere." Her mother looked around the room, her eyes landing on the attic door in the ceiling. "The attic," she said. "It might not be able to follow us up there." Sarah hesitated. The thought of climbing into the dark, cramped space above them didn't feel much safer, but she didn't see another option. Her mother grabbed a chair and dragged it beneath the attic hatch. "Come on," she urged. Sarah helped Danny onto the chair, then climbed up herself. Her mother pulled the hatch open and extended the ladder, her movements frantic. "Go, go," she said, pushing Danny up first. The boy scrambled into the attic and Sarah followed, pulling herself up into the darkness. Her mother climbed up last, pulling the ladder in behind her and slamming the hatch shut. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound their labored breathing. The attic was cold, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. "Do you think it can get up here?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," her mother replied, her voice barely audible. Danny clung to Sarah, his small body trembling. "I want to go home," he said, his voice cracking. "We are home," Sarah said softly, though the words felt hollow. Below them, the creature roared again. The sound was so loud it shook the walls, and Sarah could hear the sound of furniture being thrown across the room. "It's tearing the house apart," her mother said, gripping the knife tightly. The jingling bell started again, louder this time, as if the creature knew exactly where they were. And then they heard it. The ladder creaked. Sarah's heart stopped as she realized what was happening. The creature wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the house. Her mother motioned for them to stay quiet, pressing a finger to her lips. The creaking grew louder as the ladder shifted under the weight of something heavy. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. She could see the faint outline of the hatch in the floor, the only barrier between them and the thing below. Then the jingling bell stopped. The silence was deafening, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly the hatch rattled, the sound making Sarah jump. The creature roared again, slamming against the hatch with such force that it cracked slightly. Her mother raised the knife, her hands shaking. "Stay behind me," she whispered. Sarah pulled Danny closer, her eyes fixed on the hatch. She could see the wood splintering, the edges bending under the pressure. And then, with a deafening crash, the hatch gave way. The creature's glowing eyes appeared first, followed by its twisted antlers and grotesque grin. It pulled itself into the attic, its claws sinking into the wooden beams. "Run!" her mother screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The creature lunged, its massive hand reaching for Sarah. The creature's hand stretched towards Sarah, its blackened claws glinting faintly in the dim attic light. Time seemed to slow as Sarah froze, unable to move or scream. Her mother stepped in front of her, slashing at the air with the knife. "Get back!" her mother yelled, her voice trembling but fierce. The creature's roar shook the attic, the sound so deep and guttural it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. It paused for a moment as though assessing the threat, before lunging forward again, its antlers brushing the low ceiling. Her mother swung the knife, the blade slicing through the air and narrowly missing the creature's hand. It recoiled slightly, snarling, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Sarah, take Danny and go," her mother shouted, her voice cracking. "Where?" "There's nowhere to go," Sarah cried, clutching Danny tightly. Her mother didn't answer. Instead, she lunged at the creature again, the knife glinting as she aimed for its arm. The blade sank into its flesh, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek that made Sarah clap her hands over Danny's ears. The creature jerked back, pulling the knife from her mother's hand as it retreated slightly. Black, tar-like blood oozed from the wound, dripping onto the wooden floorboards. Sarah's mother turned to her, her face pale and determined. "Go to the far corner. Hide." "No, I'm not leaving you," Sarah shouted, tears streaming down her face. "Do as I say," her mother barked, her voice filled with an authority that left no room for argument. Sarah grabbed Danny and pulled him to the far corner of the attic, where they huddled behind an old stack of boxes. Danny was shaking so hard that Sarah could feel his teeth chattering, but she wrapped her arms around him, trying to steady him, and herself. The creature roared again, louder this time, and lunged at her mother. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws slashing through the air. Her mother ducked, rolling out of the way just in time. "Come on, you monster," she muttered under her breath, grabbing a broken piece of wood from the floor. She held it like a makeshift spear, her hands trembling but steady enough to aim. The creature seemed to hesitate for a moment, tilting its head as though confused by her defiance. Then it snarled, lunging at her again. Sarah watched in horror as her mother thrust the wooden plank forward. It struck the creature's chest, but instead of slowing down, It seemed to fuel its rage. It swatted the plank aside as though it were nothing, sending her mother sprawling onto the floor. "No," Sarah screamed, standing up instinctively. "Stay down, Sarah," her mother yelled, coughing as she struggled to get back to her feet. The creature turned its head toward Sarah, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. It grinned, its jagged teeth gleaming in the faint light. "Don't you dare touch her," her mother shouted, throwing herself at the creature. She grabbed one of its antlers, using all her strength to pull its head back. The creature roared, thrashing wildly as it tried to shake her off. "Run, Sarah. Now." Sarah's heart pounded as she looked around the attic. There had to be something, anything, they could use to escape. Her eyes landed on a small, square window near the far end of the attic. "Mom, the window," she shouted. Her mother glanced back, her eyes widening with understanding. "Get Danny and go." Sarah didn't hesitate this time. She grabbed Danny's hand and pulled him toward the window. The icy cold air seeped through the cracks as she struggled to push it open. It was small, barely big enough for her and Danny to squeeze through, but it was their only chance. "Come on, Danny," she said, lifting him up. "You first?" Danny hesitated, looking back at their mother. "What about Mom?" "She'll follow us," Sarah promised, though her voice wavered. "Just go." Danny climbed through the window, his small frame slipping out onto the slanted roof. Sarah followed, her hands gripping the icy edge as she pulled herself through. The snow-covered shingles were slick and treacherous, and she struggled to keep her balance. "Mom, come on," she called, looking back. Her mother was still fighting the creature, her grip on its antlers slipping. The creature roared again, slamming its head against the wooden beams to shake her off. "Go," her mother shouted. "I'll hold it off." "No, you have to come with us," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. The creature finally managed to throw her mother off, sending her crashing into a pile of old furniture. It turned toward the window, its glowing eyes locking onto Sarah. "Mom?" Sarah screamed, reaching out a hand. Her mother looked at her, her face filled with a mixture of love and determination. "I'll be right behind you," she said, though they both knew it was a lie. The creature lunged toward the window, its massive body barely fitting through the small frame. Sarah grabbed Danny and slid down the slanted roof, the icy surface speeding their descent. Behind them, the creature roared in frustration, its claws scraping against the edge of the roof. Sarah and Danny hit the ground hard, the snow cushioning their fall but knocking the wind out of them. Sarah struggled to her feet, pulling Danny up as well. "Run," she said, her voice hoarse. They stumbled through the snow, the cold biting at their skin. The jingling bells started again, louder and faster, as the creature chased after them. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. She could hear its heavy footsteps, the crunch of snow as it closed the distance between them. "Keep going, Danny," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't stop." The woods loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Sarah knew it wasn't safe, but they had no choice. If they stayed in the open, the creature would catch them. They plunged into the trees, the branches clawing at their clothes and faces. The jingling bells seemed to echo around them, coming from every direction. "Sarah, I'm scared," Danny cried, his voice breaking. "I know," Sarah said, pulling him closer. "But we're going to be okay. Just keep running." The creature's roar cut through the air, closer than before. Sarah's heart sank as she realized it was gaining on them. "Over here," a voice shouted suddenly. Sarah stopped, her breath hitching. It wasn't her mother's voice. It was deeper, older, but somehow familiar. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. "Come this way. Hurry." The voice came from deeper in the woods, its tone urgent but calm. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure if she could trust it, but the creature's roar behind her left no time for doubt. She grabbed Danny's hand and ran toward the voice, her heart pounding with fear and hope. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly in front of Sarah, their dark trunks towering over her like sentinels. Each step she took was a struggle against the snow, the cold biting at her skin, and the sharp branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. Danny was panting beside her, his little legs barely keeping up as he stumbled over the uneven ground. "Where's the voice coming from?" Sarah whispered, glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the creature looming just behind them. But the woods were quiet, save for the wind and the crunch of their footsteps in the snow. It felt wrong. Too quiet. Then the voice called again, louder this time. "Hurry. You're almost there." Sarah turned toward the sound. There, through a gap in the trees, she saw a faint flicker of light. A fire? A lantern? Her heart skipped a beat. "Danny, come on," she urged, pulling him along as she picked up the pace, the distant light growing brighter. But as they moved closer, the woods around them seemed to grow darker, the trees crowding in, blocking out what little light there was. Every step felt heavier, as though the very earth was trying to hold them back. "Mom?" Danny suddenly cried, stopping dead in his tracks. Sarah froze, her heart sinking. She knew what he meant. Her mother was still back there, fighting that creature, and no matter how fast they ran, they couldn't leave her behind. "We have to keep going, Danny," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "We'll come back for her. We have to stay safe first." Danny wiped his tears on his sleeve and nodded reluctantly, but his fear was palpable. As they continued through the snow-covered forest, the path seemed to twist and turn on its own, leading them deeper into the woods. The light grew brighter now. Just ahead, there was something there, something big. Sarah's mind raced, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the voice was clear, the urgency in it undeniable. "Almost there," it repeated, and this time, there was something else in the tone, something that made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. They reached a clearing, and the sight before them stopped Sarah in her tracks. At the center of the clearing was an old cabin, crooked and decaying, its windows dark and empty. A weak, flickering light shone from inside, casting eerie shadows across the snow. "Who's there?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. The door creaked open slowly, and a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, thin, with a weathered face covered in a tangle of gray beard. His clothes were ragged, and his eyes, though kind, held a deep sadness. "You're safe now," he said in a low, gravelly voice, stepping forward. "Come inside quickly." Sarah hesitated. There was something about him that seemed off. But her instincts screamed at her to trust him, to take refuge, even if just for a moment. "Come on, Danny," Sarah whispered, pulling him along. They hurried inside the cabin, where the fire burned low in a stone fireplace, casting long shadows on the walls. The room was small, with only a few pieces of furniture. An old wooden table, a single chair, and a large, rusted stove. The man shut the door behind them with a soft thud, securing it. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice low but urgent. "What's going on? What's after us?" The man sighed deeply, sitting down on the chair and gesturing for them to sit. Sarah and Danny did as he said, though the unease gnawing at her stomach wouldn't let her relax. "My name is Elias," the man said. "And what's after you is a thing of darkness. A spirit born from the very heart of Christmas, twisted and corrupted over the years. It's been hunting children for generations, using the holiday to mask its true nature." "A spirit?" Sarah repeated, her mind racing. "But why us? Why now?" Elias' eyes grew distant as he looked into the fire. "Because you're part of its curse. The creature, the Krampus, as the legends call it, can only be stopped by those it chooses. It hunts the innocent, the pure-hearted, and it feasts on fear. You were meant to be its next victims." A cold shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She had heard whispers about Krampus, the dark, twisted figure that was said to punish bad children during Christmas. But she had always thought it was just a myth, a story told to keep kids in line. "Are you saying the creature outside is Krampus?" Danny whispered, his eyes wide with terror. Elias nodded solemnly. "Yes, and it will not stop until it has what it came for." "But why are we here?" Sarah asked. "How do you know about this? What do we do?" Elias leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've been hunting Krampus for years. It's been a part of my life since I was a boy, and I've learned its ways. I know how it thinks, how it moves. But the thing is, there's no escaping it once it's chosen you. You can hide, you can run, but it will always find you." Sarah's heart raced. "Then why did you bring us here? If we can't escape it, then what's the point?" Elias' eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was a spark of something else in his gaze, a glimmer of hope. "Because there is a way to fight back. Krampus feeds on fear, but it's also bound by rules. There's a way to weaken it, to send it back to where it came from. But it requires a sacrifice." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of sacrifice?" Elias stood, walking to a small shelf in the corner of the cabin. He pulled down a dusty old book and opened it to a page marked with a blackened ribbon. "The spirit can only be banished if the pure-hearted willingly offer themselves," he said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of years of knowledge. "One must face the creature and stand against it without fear. Only then can the curse be lifted. But it's a test, and very few survive." "Are you saying that one of us has to sacrifice ourselves?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Elias nodded gravely. Yes. Only by confronting Krampus without fear can the curse be broken. But it's not just a matter of standing firm. You must give everything, your spirit, your soul, to ensure it never returns. Sarah felt the room spin, her thoughts racing. You're saying we have to offer ourselves? To give up everything? The fire crackled, its light dancing across Elias' face, casting his expression in an eerie glow. Only by doing so can you truly end this nightmare. But be warned, it will not be easy. Krampus feeds on the desperate, and it will try to turn your fear into doubt. Suddenly, the wind howled outside, and the faint jingling of bells reached their ears, chilling them to the bone. The creature was close. Elias turned toward the door. It's here, he whispered, and it will not rest until it gets what it wants. Sarah's heart raced as the cabin door rattled violently. She looked at Danny, who was holding on to her tightly, his face pale with fear. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But there was no time left to think. The creature was coming for them, and the only way to stop it was to face it head on. Stay close, she whispered to Danny, her voice shaking but determined. Whatever happens, don't let go of me. And as the door began to splinter under the force of the creature's claws, Sarah made her decision. She would face the monster, even if it meant everything. The door of the cabin trembled under the weight of Krampus's assault, the sound of claws raking against wood sending vibrations through the walls. The jingling bells grew louder, their eerie clatter blending with the thumping of the creature's footsteps outside. Sarah's breath hitched as she looked at Danny, his wide eyes filled with terror, his small hands clutching her tightly. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew something was wrong, something that went beyond the nightmares and the Christmas stories he had heard. Stay behind me, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling but firm. Her mind raced, her thoughts jumbled with fear, disbelief, and determination. Her mother's face flashed in her memory. She could still see her mother's desperate smile before the creature had taken her. Sarah had promised to return for her, but now it seemed that promise was as fragile as the life they were fighting to protect. Elias stood near the window, his face etched with a kind of sorrow Sarah couldn't fully understand. He was readying himself as though he had done this many times before. The fire crackled behind him, casting dancing shadows on the walls. There was a certain stillness about him, a quiet intensity that unnerved Sarah. He wasn't afraid, but then again maybe he had learned to bury his fear long ago. Elias, Sarah said, her voice low. What do we do now? Elias didn't turn to face her right away. He just kept his eyes on the door, his expression unreadable. After a long moment he spoke, his voice steady. We wait, he said simply. Krampus is relentless, but it doesn't attack immediately. It wants to scare you. It wants to break you. How do you know that? Sarah asked, a chill running down her spine. Elias's gaze finally shifted to her, and for the first time, she saw something close to regret in his eyes. Because I've seen it before, he said softly. I've seen families torn apart by fear, by the curse that comes with it. And I've lost everything trying to fight it. His words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers about his past, about the creature that had haunted him for so long, but she couldn't find the words. The door creaked again, louder this time. Krampus was at the threshold. The air inside the cabin grew thick with anticipation, the tension unbearable. Krampus was so close now, Sarah could hear its growls, low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. The jingling bells rang again, faster, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something awful. Then the door burst open with a deafening crash. The creature stood there, massive and dark, filling the doorway like some kind of nightmarish shadow. Its blackened antlers scraped against the top of the frame, and its glowing eyes locked onto Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The rancid smell of decay and earth wafted into the cabin, choking the air, suffocating her. It was here. Krampus's voice was a twisted hiss, like 1,000 whispers coming from the depths of hell. You think you can hide from me? It crooned, its voice low and menacing. You think you can escape the price for your sins? Sarah took a shaky step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what it wanted. She knew what it had come for. But she wouldn't give in. Not now. Not when her family's life was on the line. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but there was a defiance in her tone that surprised even her. Krampus's smile twisted into something grotesque, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. It stepped forward, its claws scraping the floor with each movement. You should be, it said, its voice almost playful now. You should be terrified, because fear is what feeds me. Fear is what makes me stronger. Sarah clenched her fists, trying to summon the strength to stand her ground. She had seen the creature, heard the stories. She knew the horror it could bring. But in this moment, with Danny by her side, she realized something. She couldn't let fear control her. Not again. Not after everything they had been through. Get away from us, Sarah said, her voice growing louder with each word. We won't let you win. The creature paused for a moment, its eyes narrowing as if testing her resolve. Then it let out a low, rumbling laugh, a sound that sent chills through Sarah's bones. You don't get it, do you? Krampus snarled. You think you can defy me? I've been hunting your kind for centuries. I know your fears better than you know yourself. The creature raised its massive claw and swiped at the air, sending a blast of cold wind through the room. The fire sputtered, the flames flickering as though struggling to stay alive. The light dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch towards Sarah and Danny like fingers reaching out from the darkness. Elias didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his face grim, his eyes filled with an understanding that Sarah couldn't quite grasp. He stepped forward, his voice calm but laced with urgency. We need to stop it now, he said, turning to Sarah. It's not just here to kill, it's here to take your soul. And if it succeeds, it will never stop hunting you. Sarah felt a chill run through her at his words. What do you mean? How do we stop it? Elias met her gaze, his expression serious. You have to face it, not just physically but emotionally. It feeds on fear, but it also feeds on doubt. If you let it in, if you let it make you doubt yourself, then it will win. But if you stand your ground and face it without hesitation, without fear. He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he turned back to Krampus, who was now stepping fully into the room, its eyes flashing with hunger. The creature let out a low growl, its breath heavy in the stillness. You can't defeat me, child, it hissed. I am Christmas. I am the punishment for those who've strayed. I am the darkness that shadows this holiday. Sarah's pulse raced as she felt Danny's grip tighten on her hand. He was so small, so fragile, and Sarah realized in that moment just how much she had to protect him. She couldn't let this creature take him or her or anyone else. She had to face it. You're not Christmas, Sarah said, her voice trembling but strong. You're just a monster. And you're not welcome here. The creature's eyes flickered, its lips curling into a sneer. And what will you do about it? In that moment, Sarah felt something change inside her. The fear that had gripped her for so long, the fear that had paralyzed her in the face of this monster, began to fade. It didn't disappear completely, but it wasn't the driving force anymore. She stepped forward, keeping Danny behind her. She felt a strange calmness settle over her, a sense of purpose she had never known. I'll make you leave, she said, her voice steady and firm. Krampus's eyes widened slightly, as though taken aback by the strength in her words. It snarled and lunged, its claws flashing in the dim light. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't move. As the creature reached for her, she closed her eyes for a brief moment, and in that moment, something deep within her stirred. A memory, her mother's voice, soft but strong, echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you are stronger than you think. You can face anything no matter how dark it seems. Asterisk. With a sudden burst of energy, Sarah reached for the fire poker near the fireplace and thrust it forward, aiming for Krampus's chest. The creature roared, its claws swiping at her, but it wasn't fast enough. The poker hit its mark, driving deep into the creature's flesh. The darkness around them seemed to quiver, as if the very air was alive with the struggle. Krampus let out an ear-piercing scream, the sound reverberating through the cabin. The force of the blow sent it stumbling back, its claws scraping against the walls. It was wounded, and for the first time, Sarah felt like they had a chance. Now Elias, she shouted. Elias nodded, his expression resolute. He reached for a small vial at his belt, uncorking it and pouring the contents onto the floor. The liquid hissed and bubbled as it hit the ground, sending a faint smoke swirling into the air. Krampus howled in fury, its body jerking as the smoke enveloped it. But it wasn't enough to stop it yet. Together, Elias said, his voice filled with grim determination. We have to finish it now. As Sarah stood tall, her heart pounding, she realized one undeniable truth. They had only one chance. And she wouldn't let fear stop her now. The moment Elias spoke, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline course through her veins. She knew what she had to do, but the weight of it all, of fighting a creature like Krampus, was still almost too much to bear. Her hands shook, but she clenched them into fists, her eyes locking onto Krampus as it writhed in pain, the thick smoke clouding its form. The creature screeched, a high-pitched wail that made the floorboards tremble beneath their feet. But they couldn't hesitate. Not now. Elias moved swiftly, his motions practiced and deliberate as he reached into his coat and pulled out a strange, glowing relic. Sarah had seen it before, but she didn't know exactly what it was. It seemed to shimmer with an ethereal light, casting long shadows that danced across the cabin. "Elias, what is that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with uncertainty. "It's the only thing that can hold Krampus at bay," Elias said, his tone grim. "A relic passed down through generations. It's made from the bones of those who have faced this creature before, those who have survived. And it's the only thing that can weaken him enough for us to finish this." Sarah took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. She had no idea if this relic would work, if it was truly their only hope. But the alternative, surrendering to the darkness, was unthinkable. With a sharp movement, Elias hurled the relic toward Krampus. The moment it touched the ground, a brilliant light erupted from it, blinding in its intensity. The creature let out a guttural roar, its claws swiping at the air in an attempt to shield itself. The smoke surrounding it thickened, swirling faster as the light from the relic grew stronger. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light began to fade. But the damage was done. Krampus was no longer the towering figure of terror it had once been. Its form had shrunk, the massive antlers now reduced to jagged, broken fragments. The glowing eyes that had once pierced through the darkness were now dull, almost lifeless. It was weakening. But even in its diminished state, Krampus was far from done. The creature, its body now crackling with dark energy, lunged forward with a snarl, its claws aimed directly for Sarah. She barely had time to react before it was upon her. Her heart raced, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she thought it would be the end. But Elias was faster. With a shout, he grabbed hold of the relic, now glowing dimly in his hands, and thrust it forward into Krampus's chest. There was a violent burst of energy, a flash of light so bright it lit up the entire cabin, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. When the light subsided, the creature was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah blinked, still reeling from the rush of adrenaline, trying to process what had just happened. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her body trembling from the shock of it all. The fear, the overwhelming, suffocating fear, had receded, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. But despite the victory, something didn't feel right. Sarah glanced around the cabin, her eyes scanning the now empty space. The fire crackled in the hearth, the warmth of it comforting against the cold, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood motionless, his gaze distant, as if he were listening for something. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath. Then finally he spoke, his voice grave. "No," he said softly. "It's not over. Not yet." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the cabin. It was distant at first, almost faint, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. The walls seemed to tremble again, the floor beneath their feet shaking as the sound intensified. "Krampus?" Sarah breathed, her heart sinking. Elias shook his head slowly, his face pale. "No, that wasn't Krampus. It's something else." The ground beneath their feet rumbled, a deep, thunderous vibration that sent dust falling from the ceiling. It was like the entire forest had come alive and something far worse than Krampus was on the move. "Something worse?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Elias nodded, his expression grim. "Krampus is a spirit, a creature of darkness, but this is something else. Something older, more powerful. And if it's here..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. Fear not of Krampus, but of something far more terrifying. The rumble grew louder, the walls of the cabin creaking under the pressure, as though the very structure was about to collapse. Then, just as Sarah was about to speak, the door burst open once again, and a wave of cold air swept into the cabin. A shadow, long and twisted, loomed in the doorway. The figure was barely visible in the dim light, but Sarah could make out the glint of sharp, pointed teeth, and the unmistakable gleam of blood-red eyes. It was the source of the rumbling, and it was coming for them. In a single, swift movement, Elias pulled Sarah and Danny behind him, his voice low but urgent. "Get to the basement. Now." "Elias, what is that?" Sarah demanded, her heart racing as she watched the figure step into the cabin, its presence filling the space with a sense of suffocating darkness. "It's the one who controls Krampus," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one who commands the nightmares. The one who will stop at nothing to ensure that Krampus's curse never ends." The creature took a step forward, its eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. It wasn't human, nor was it a spirit like Krampus. It was something far worse, a being born from the darkest corners of every legend, every myth, and every nightmare. "We don't have much time," Elias said urgently. "Get to the basement. Now." Without another word, Sarah grabbed Danny's hand, pulling him with her as they rushed toward the back of the cabin. The creature was closing in, its footsteps heavy and slow, as though it were savoring their fear. As they reached the basement door, Elias threw a glance over his shoulder, his face filled with dread. "Hurry. This is the only chance we have." With a final push, they entered the basement, the door slamming shut behind them. The darkness pressed in around them, and Sarah could hear her own breath coming in ragged gasps. But she knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. The basement door groaned under the strain as Sarah, Danny, and Elias hurried down the narrow stairs, the darkness swallowing them whole. The cold in the air was suffocating, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The only sounds were their hurried footsteps and the frantic beat of Sarah's heart. She pulled Danny closer to her, her arm wrapped tightly around him, as if holding him could shield him from whatever was waiting upstairs. "What was that thing?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. Her mind was still reeling from the events unfolding around them. She had barely had time to process the horror of Krampus before something far worse had appeared. Elias didn't respond immediately. His expression was tight, as if he were wrestling with something in his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and strained. "It's called the Harbinger," Elias said, his eyes distant. "It's an ancient being, older than Krampus, older than any of the legends. It controls the dark creatures, the nightmares. It's the force behind the curse that's been haunting you. And now that it's here, it won't stop until it has everything." Sarah's heart sank. She had never heard of such a creature before. Krampus had been bad enough, but this was something entirely different, something that defied everything she thought she knew about the world. The Harbinger wasn't just a monster. It was the source, the one who orchestrated the horrors of Christmas, the one who made them real. "How do we stop it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she didn't know if she really wanted to hear the answer. Elias's face tightened. "We don't. Not by ourselves." "What do you mean?" Sarah shot back, her pulse racing. "We have to stop it. We can't just hide down here and wait for it to find us." Elias turned to face her, his expression full of sorrow. "The Harbinger isn't something you can fight with weapons or strength. It feeds off fear, yes, but it also feeds off hope, off the belief that you can win. And right now, that's the one thing we don't have." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating her. How could they fight something like this? Something so powerful, so ancient, that it could manipulate not just Krampus but every dark thing that lurked in the world? "Then what do we do?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. "What do you want me to do? Just give up?" Elias looked at her with a mix of pity and understanding. "No, we don't give up. But you need to understand that we can't defeat the Harbinger directly. It's not a battle we can win with brute force." "What do you mean then?" Sarah's voice shook with frustration. "What's the point of all this if we can't fight it?" "There's one way," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "One way to weaken it enough that we have a chance. But it's dangerous, and it's something no one has done in centuries." Sarah's mind raced, trying to grasp at the hope in his words. "What is it? What do we have to do?" Elias hesitated, then met her gaze with a look of resignation. "We have to get to the heart of it. We have to find the source, the place where the Harbinger draws its power. If we can reach it, if we can destroy that source, we might have a chance to stop everything else." "Where is it?" Sarah asked, her voice fierce. "The forest," Elias replied softly. "Where the darkness began. That's where it is. And that's where we have to go." Sarah's stomach churned at the thought. The forest was a place of nightmares, a place she had always avoided. It was where people went missing, where strange occurrences were whispered about but never truly understood. It was the heart of the terror, the place where the curse had been born. To go there was to step into the very belly of the beast. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Elias nodded, though his expression was filled with doubt. "We don't have a choice. If we don't destroy the source, the harbinger will never stop. It will keep coming, keep bringing creatures like Krampus, keep twisting everything good and pure into darkness." Danny, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly tugged at Sarah's sleeve. She looked down at him, her heart tightening at the fear in his wide eyes. He didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation, but she could see the uncertainty in him, the worry that was mirrored in her own heart. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Danny asked, his voice small, fragile. Sarah knelt down beside him, her heart breaking at the vulnerability in his eyes. She wanted to promise him that everything would be okay, that they would be safe, but she couldn't bring herself to lie. Not now. Not when everything felt so uncertain, so out of control. "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. "But we're going to fight. We're going to do everything we can." Elias's voice broke through their moment of silence. "We don't have much time. The harbinger is getting closer, and if we don't act fast, it will consume everything in its path. We have to go now." Sarah stood, taking Danny's hand, and nodded. There was no turning back. She had to protect him, to make sure that they survived this no matter the cost. They moved swiftly through the dark, winding corridors of the basement, coming to a small iron door at the back. Elias pulled the door open, revealing a narrow passage leading outside. The cold air hit them immediately, biting at their skin, but there was no time to waste. They had to reach the forest, and they had to do it before it was too late. As they stepped outside, Sarah felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. The wind howled, and the trees in the distance seemed to groan under the pressure of the storm that was building. But it wasn't the storm she was worried about. It was the darkness that was spreading, the force that had already claimed so much. And as they stepped into the night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking directly into the heart of the nightmare. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky like the hands of the dead. It was impossible to see what lay beyond the tree line, but Sarah could feel its presence. The forest was alive in a way that was unnatural, pulsing with a malevolent energy that seemed to draw her in. Elias led the way, his pace steady, though his face was etched with worry. They had no choice now. The only hope they had was to reach the heart of the forest, to find the source of the harbinger's power, and to destroy it before the creature could spread its darkness any further. As they walked, the wind began to pick up, howling through the trees like the voices of the damned. Sarah glanced over her shoulder once, but the cabin had already disappeared into the shadows. There was no turning back. The night was closing in around them, the darkness thickening with every step. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, a voice whispered, soft, slithering like the rustling of dead leaves. "Welcome, Sarah. Welcome to your doom." The voice echoed through the trees like a haunting melody, curling around Sarah's thoughts, tugging at her mind. She froze for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. It was as though the forest itself had spoken, the trees shifting and groaning as if alive, and something far darker than she could comprehend was watching her. The voice wasn't just a whisper, it was a presence, an entity wrapped in the very air around them. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Elias, who had been walking ahead, stopped and turned toward her. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't listen to it," he warned, his voice shaky. "It's trying to get inside your head. Whatever you do, don't let it." But it was too late. The voice had already planted a seed of doubt in her mind, a creeping suspicion that something terrible awaited them at the heart of this cursed forest. As they continued forward, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, the shadows seeming to shift in the corners of her vision. The wind howled around them, pushing them deeper into the woods as if the forest itself was alive, guiding them toward an inevitable fate. Elias, sensing her unease, glanced over his shoulder. "Stay close," he said. "We're almost there. Just a little further." They pressed on, the dense trees growing closer together, their branches twisting into gnarled shapes, reaching toward them like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, thicker with the smell of decay. Every step felt like a weight, as though the very earth beneath their feet was pulling them deeper into the heart of darkness. Suddenly, Danny tugged at Sarah's sleeve. She looked down at him, and her heart sank at the look on his face. His eyes were wide with terror, his skin pale as he stared at something in the distance. "Mom, what is that?" Danny's voice trembled, his words barely audible. Sarah followed his gaze, her blood running cold when she saw what he was pointing at. In the distance, barely visible through the trees, was a figure, tall and imposing, its silhouette standing against the dim glow of the moon. The creature was nothing like Krampus or anything they had seen before. It stood motionless, its outline shifting in and out of focus as though it were made of shadows. Elias's face went rigid, and he pulled Sarah and Danny closer. "We need to keep moving. Don't look at it. Don't engage with it." But it was too late. The creature seemed to notice them, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, locking onto Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It didn't move, at least not at first, but its presence seemed to press down on her, heavy and oppressive. The air around them seemed to hold its breath, and Sarah felt the weight of its gaze like a physical force. "Elias, what is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Elias didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained locked on the creature, his expression tense. "It's a warden," he said finally, his voice strained. "An ancient guardian. It's a manifestation of the forest's will, an entity that ensures no one trespasses too far into its heart. It's not here to help us. It's here to stop us." The warden took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. It wasn't entirely solid. Its body was composed of swirling shadows and fog, and its glowing eyes were the only things that seemed real. The ground beneath its feet seemed to shift and tremble, as though the earth itself was responding to its presence. "Can we fight it?" Sarah asked, her voice rising with panic. "No," Elias replied quickly. "You can't fight it. It's tied to the forest itself. The only way to get past it is to find its weakness, and hope it's enough." The warden stopped just out of reach, its eyes never leaving them. For a long moment, the forest seemed to fall into an eerie silence, the wind halting, the distant cries of animals ceasing. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. And then, without warning, the creature spoke. "You dare enter my domain?" The voice was low, ancient, and full of malice. It reverberated through the trees, filling the air with an unsettling, unearthly echo. "You bring the scent of death with you." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. This was no ordinary creature. This was a force of nature, something far older than anything she had ever known. And it wasn't about to let them continue. "We don't have time for this," Elias muttered under his breath. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Sarah and the warden. "We need to get to the heart of the forest. You can't stop us." The warden's gaze flickered to Elias, and for a moment, it seemed to consider him. The tension in the air was thick, and Sarah could feel every muscle in her body screaming to run, to flee from this terror that loomed before them. But she held her ground, focusing on Elias, who was now speaking in a language she couldn't understand, his voice growing more urgent. The creature's eyes narrowed, and it tilted its head as if contemplating his words. "You think you can defy me? You think you can escape this place?" It whispered, the air around them thickening with an unnatural cold. "You will never leave. You will never see the dawn." With that, the warden lunged forward, a blur of darkness and shadow, faster than Sarah could react. It struck with the force of 100 storms, knocking Elias backward. He hit the ground with a thud, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might not get up. "Elias!" Sarah screamed, rushing toward him, but before she could reach him, the warden turned its attention back to her, its glowing eyes narrowing. It was as if it could see right through her, into the very depths of her soul. "Do you understand now, mortal?" the warden hissed, its voice echoing in Sarah's mind. "There is no escape. You are lost." For a moment, Sarah was paralyzed with fear. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world seemed to tilt, the edges of her vision darkening as the warden's presence overwhelmed her. But then, something in her snapped. She couldn't let this creature win. Not now. Not when they were so close. She had to keep fighting for herself, for Danny, for Elias. "Danny, get behind me," she shouted, her voice hoarse with fear. Danny didn't hesitate. He ran to her side, and Sarah pulled him close, shielding him with her body. Elias, still struggling to rise, finally got to his feet, his eyes blazing with determination. "We have to push through," Elias said, his voice fierce. "We can't let it stop us." The warden loomed over them, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't sure how they would defeat this creature, but she knew one thing: they weren't going to give up. Not now. Not when they had come this far. And then, without warning, the warden opened its mouth, a gaping chasm of darkness that seemed to pull in all the light around them. Sarah felt herself being pulled toward it, her feet moving on their own as if the warden's will had taken hold of her. But Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "It's using its power to control you," he shouted. "Resist it." With every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah forced herself to look away from the warden, to focus on the path ahead. She couldn't let this thing win. She had to get to the heart of the forest. She had to stop the harbinger. The darkness roared around them, but they kept moving. They had no choice. The warden was just a test, a barrier, a warning. But they had to push forward no matter what. And so, with the warden's gaze burning into their backs, they ran. The wind howled like a chorus of the damned as Sarah, Elias, and Danny plunged deeper into the forest, the trees pressing in around them like walls closing in. The ground beneath their feet was soft, muddy, each step sucking at their shoes as if the earth itself was trying to drag them down into its depths. The warden's voice still echoed in Sarah's mind, its words repeating over and over like a chant. "There is no escape," it had said. "You are lost." Despite the terror that gripped her heart, Sarah refused to give in. She had a purpose now, a reason to keep moving. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting Danny, about making sure they reached the heart of this cursed forest before it was too late. The source of the Harbinger's power was close. She could feel it in her bones, and if they didn't reach it in time, she didn't want to think about what would happen. Elias was a few steps ahead, his pace steady but urgent. He knew this forest, knew its dangers. But Sarah had seen enough to understand that even he couldn't predict everything. The forest itself seemed alive, its twisted branches reaching toward them as if trying to trap them within its grasp. The trees groaned under the weight of something far older than them, something that had seen centuries pass without ever blinking an eye. "Keep moving," Elias said, his voice sharp with the need for speed. "We're close, but we have to be careful. The forest doesn't like people who get too close to its core." Sarah's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows between the trees. The further they went, the darker it became. The sky, once clear and full of stars, was now obscured by thick, oppressive clouds. The air was cold, freezing even, and every step forward felt like a struggle against something far stronger than them. And then, suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A low rumble reverberated through the earth, the trees shaking as if responding to an unseen force. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The familiar feeling of dread crept back over her, crawling under her skin, making her pulse race. "What was that?" Danny whispered, clutching her hand tightly. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. She turned to Elias, but he was already moving again, urging them to follow. "We have to keep going. This is nothing. The forest is waking up. It's trying to stop us, but we can't let it." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded, pressing forward. Danny was still holding on to her, his small hand clutching her tightly. She couldn't help but wonder if he even understood what was happening. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was a battle to stop the Harbinger from unleashing its full power on the world. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting and contorting in unnatural shapes. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. No animals, no birds, nothing but the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias paused again, this time more abruptly. He held up his hand, signaling for silence. Sarah strained her ears, but all she could hear was the steady thud of her own heartbeat in her ears. Then she heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. Her heart stopped. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elias didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the darkness ahead, his expression tense. "Stay close," he said, his voice strained. "Whatever it is, we need to be ready." A shadow shifted in the distance, something moving, something large. Sarah couldn't make out its shape, but she could feel its presence. It was watching them. She could feel its eyes on her back, pressing into her skin like a weight she couldn't escape. Danny tugged at her sleeve, his face pale with fear. "Mom, I don't want to go any further," he said, his voice small and shaking. Sarah knelt down beside him, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We have to, sweetie," she said softly. "We're almost there. Just a little further, and then we can get out of here." But deep down, Sarah wasn't sure if that was true. She wasn't sure if they could escape whatever was waiting for them in the heart of this forest. The harbinger was close. She could feel it like a dark pulse thrumming beneath the earth. And then, without warning, the growl came again, closer this time, louder, more terrifying. The trees seemed to part, revealing a figure standing in their path. It was massive, towering over them like a giant, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. The creature was covered in thick, matted fur, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Its breath came in deep, ragged gasps, steam rising from its nostrils in the freezing air. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the sense of familiarity. She had seen this thing before. Krampus. But this wasn't the Krampus they had already faced. This one was bigger, more monstrous, its form twisted by the dark magic of the harbinger. It wasn't just a creature of punishment anymore, it was something else entirely, something far more dangerous, far more hungry. "Mom, is that Krampus?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded, but her throat was tight, her words caught. This wasn't the same creature they had fought off in the cabin. This was something far worse, something that had been corrupted by the very force they were trying to stop. The harbinger's influence had taken root in everything. The darkness had infected everything in its path. Elias raised his hand, signaling for them to stay still. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "We have to wait for the right moment." But Sarah could feel it. The air was thick with dread. The creature's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. The forest was silent, as though holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The Krampus, no, the thing that had once been Krampus, took a step forward, its massive hooves crunching through the snow and leaves. It was close now, far too close, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her legs frozen in place. She wanted to move, to run, to do something, but she couldn't. And then, in the stillness of the moment, the creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Leave now," it growled, its voice low and dangerous. "You do not belong here." Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her behind him, ready to fight, but the Krampus creature wasn't finished. It lunged forward, a blur of fur and claws, its massive hands swiping through the air toward them. "Run!" Elias shouted, his voice filled with panic. Sarah didn't think, she just moved. She grabbed Danny's hand and ran, her feet slipping in the mud, her heart racing as the creature gave chase. The sound of its growls filled her ears, the earth trembling beneath her as the force of its pursuit shook the ground. They weren't safe. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The heart of the forest was still ahead, but now they had more than the harbinger to fear. They had Krampus. The ground beneath them trembled with every step, the heavy thud of Krampus's hooves echoing through the forest. Sarah didn't dare look behind her. Every nerve in her body screamed to keep running, to get as far away from the creature as possible. But she couldn't outrun it. Not with Danny in tow, not with the forest closing in around them like a prison. The only hope they had was to reach the heart of this place, to confront whatever it was that had corrupted Krampus and take back control before it was too late. Her lungs burned, and her legs ached from the effort of running through the thick mud, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Behind her, she could hear Elias shouting, but the sound of the wind, the growls of Krampus, and the crunching of twigs beneath their feet drowned everything out. "Mom? I'm scared," Danny gasped, his breath ragged. His small hand tightened around hers, and she felt a surge of protective instinct that made her heart ache. "I know, baby," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "But we're almost there. We can make it." They had to. They had no choice. The forest itself was working against them, its trees now leaning in, their gnarled branches seemingly reaching for them. Sarah swore she could hear whispers in the wind, like distant voices trying to call them back, warning them of the dangers that awaited. But she wasn't going to turn back. Not now. Not when they were so close to ending this nightmare. A loud crash behind them broke her thoughts. Krampus had broken through the trees, his massive body slamming into them with the force of a freight train. The sound of snapping wood and crushing branches filled the air, followed by the creature's low, menacing growl. It was gaining on them. Fast. Move. Move. Elias's voice cut through the chaos, and Sarah pushed herself harder, pulling Danny along with all the strength she had left. Suddenly, they broke through a small thicket of trees and into a clearing. At first, Sarah thought it was a safe haven, a place to catch her breath, but then she saw it. In the center of the clearing, illuminated by the flickering light of the moon, stood a massive stone altar, ancient and weathered, covered in strange runes that pulsed with an eerie glow. This was it. This was the heart of the forest. Elias stopped abruptly, his chest heaving as he scanned the area. "This is it," he muttered, his voice strained. "We have to stop it here. If we don't, the whole world will fall under its control." Sarah's mind raced. The altar was the key. She didn't know how or why, but she could feel it deep in her bones. The power that had corrupted Krampus, the evil that had been slowly bleeding into the world, was coming from here. From this place. "Mom, what are we going to do?" Danny asked, his voice trembling as he looked up at her. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them, something that Sarah couldn't quite place. A glimmer of understanding. A recognition of the gravity of the situation. "I don't know, Danny," she replied honestly, her own voice faltering. "But we have to destroy this. Whatever it is, we can't let it take over." The ground beneath their feet rumbled again, and Sarah felt a cold chill wash over her. She didn't need to look behind her to know that Krampus was close. She could hear his heavy breathing, the crackle of twigs and leaves as he barreled through the forest. He wasn't far, and if they didn't act fast, they would all be consumed by the darkness that was sweeping through the land. Elias stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the altar. "This is the source," he said grimly. "The Harbinger's power is bound to this place. If we can destroy it, we can stop the corruption from spreading." Sarah didn't know what kind of power the altar had, but it felt ancient and evil. Every instinct in her body told her to stay away, to run as far as possible from this cursed place, but she couldn't. She couldn't let Krampus or whatever else lurked in this forest win. Without warning, a cold gust of wind whipped through the clearing, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of Krampus's growl, closer than ever. They didn't have much time. "Elias, we need to do something now," Sarah cried, panic rising in her chest. "It's almost here." Elias turned to face her, his expression hard, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to break the seal on the altar. It's the only way to stop it." Sarah didn't ask how he knew. She didn't have time. She just nodded, stepping forward with Danny in tow. They had to act fast. The altar had to be destroyed before Krampus reached them. Elias reached out, placing his hands on the cold stone, his fingers brushing over the runes. As his hand made contact, the air seemed to hum with energy. The ground beneath them shuddered, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she felt the entire forest shift around them. The trees seemed to groan as if in protest of the disturbance. "Mom, look," Danny cried, pointing to the sky. Sarah looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. The clouds had parted, revealing a full moon, its light casting an eerie glow over the clearing. But what really made her heart race was the shape that seemed to form in the sky. It was a shadow, a silhouette of something massive, something that filled the heavens. It wasn't Krampus, but it was something else, something much worse. "This is bad," Elias said, his voice grim. "We've disturbed something far worse than we realized." The shadow in the sky seemed to grow larger, darker, and as it did, Sarah could feel the air grow colder. It wasn't just the wind, it was the very presence of the Harbinger, manifesting in the sky above them. The creature that had caused all of this, the source of the corruption. And then, out of nowhere, a loud crash sounded behind them. The trees shook violently, and before Sarah could react, she saw the massive form of Krampus, his claws outstretched, his eyes glowing with fury. "You should have never come here," he snarled, his voice low and guttural. He charged at them with terrifying speed, and Sarah didn't have time to think. She pulled Danny close, bracing herself for the worst. The only thing that mattered now was the altar. They had to destroy it. With a final burst of strength, Elias pushed against the altar, his hands glowing with an ethereal light. The runes began to glow brighter, and the earth trembled beneath them as if the world itself was fighting back. But Sarah wasn't sure if it was enough. She wasn't sure if they could stop it. Not with the Harbinger rising above them and Krampus closing in. And not with the darkness swallowing them whole. The ground shook violently beneath their feet as Elias pressed his hands harder against the altar, the runes glowing brighter by the second. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, her fear climbing with every moment, but she had no choice. The creature, Krampus, was closing in, its breath heavy and foul, its claws scraping against the stone ground. Every fiber of her being screamed for them to run, to escape, but they couldn't. The Harbinger was awakening, and this was the last chance they had to stop it. "Mom?" Danny cried, his voice trembling as he clung to her side. "What's happening?" Sarah's eyes darted between Elias, the altar, and the monstrous form of Krampus that loomed just beyond the clearing. Her breath hitched as she realized what was at stake. The world was on the edge of being consumed by darkness, and their only hope was that Elias could break the seal before it was too late. "Elias, hurry!" she shouted, panic creeping into her voice. "It's too late. He's almost here." Elias's face was pale, sweat dripping down his forehead as the energy from the altar surged through him. The air around them grew colder, the winds whipping wildly as the presence of the Harbinger grew stronger. "I'm trying." Elias gritted his teeth. "Just a little more." Krampus growled, a terrible guttural sound that sent shivers through Sarah's spine. It was too close now, and she knew they couldn't outrun him. They had no time left. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way with a deafening crack. Sarah screamed as she felt herself falling, Danny's hand slipping from hers as she tumbled into a deep, dark pit. The world around her spun, the earth pulling her down into the abyss. She reached out desperately, trying to grab anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The sound of Krampus's roar echoed in the distance, but it was swallowed by the darkness that now enveloped her. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. Sarah opened her eyes and found herself lying in the mud, the cold air biting at her skin. She groaned, pushing herself up, her head spinning. She scanned her surroundings in a haze of confusion. Where was Danny? Where was Elias? "Danny? Elias?" She called, her voice shaking. There was no answer. The clearing had disappeared. The once ominous altar was gone, and the forest seemed unnaturally still. The heavy fog rolled in, obscuring her vision, and the trees now looked like twisted skeletons, silent and lifeless. And then a figure appeared through the mist. It was Elias, but something was wrong. His eyes were vacant, lifeless, as if something had been drained from him. He was standing still, his hands at his sides, staring straight ahead, unmoving. "Elias?" Sarah asked, her voice faltering as she stumbled toward him. But he didn't respond. And that was when Sarah noticed it. Something much worse than Krampus was looming behind him. The shadow in the sky was now a tangible presence, its form dark and twisted, its influence slowly creeping over the land. The Harbinger, the ancient evil that had been at the heart of this nightmare, had risen. And it wasn't just here. It was everywhere. The once dead trees were now alive, their limbs reaching out like claws, dragging the forest into the depths of darkness. The earth trembled once again, and Sarah knew with a sickening certainty that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But there was no time to think, no time to hope for a solution. The power of the Harbinger was overwhelming, too much for anyone to fight, even with all their strength. "Mom?" Danny's voice was faint, almost a whisper. Sarah whipped around, her heart seizing in her chest. There, emerging from the fog, was her son. But he was different. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his small form standing tall as if controlled by something far beyond his age. "No?" Sarah gasped. "Danny, no." He smiled, but it wasn't the sweet, innocent smile she remembered. It was cold, twisted, like the smile of someone who had already given up, already succumbed to the darkness. "I'm sorry, Mom." Danny's voice was hollow, echoing with an eerie, distant tone. "But it's already too late. The Harbinger has won. There's no escaping it now." Sarah's heart shattered as she realized the truth. The curse was not something that could be destroyed, not something that could be stopped. The forest, the evil that had taken root in it, it was spreading, unstoppable, consuming everything in its path. Elias, Danny, Krampus, they were all part of it now. And Sarah? She was just another casualty of the forest's insidious reach. As the darkness closed in around her, Sarah let out one final breath. The forest had claimed them all. There was no escape, no redemption. The Harbinger had risen, and the world would fall beneath its shadow.